Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. This is not just a story, it's a slow unravelling of the past, meant to carry you gently into sleep while we drift together through one of the darkest chapters of human history. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. The world before the pestilence was quieter than our own. It was a world of horses on narrow dirt tracks, of bells tolling from stone towers, and of villages so small that everyone knew the faces of the living and the names of the dead. The 14th century was not a time of speed, nor of noise, nor of rushing crowds. It was a time when daylight guided life, when candles and torches held back the night only a little, and when the rhythm of work and rest followed the seasons more than the clock. Europe at the edge of the 1300s was not empty, yet it was not crowded either. Forests stretched across vast lands, rivers wound lazily through meadows, and fields of wheat and rye swayed with the wind. In these fields, peasants bent their backs to the soil. They tilled with wooden ploughs pulled by oxen, planting seeds that would be harvested months later. The life of most was simple, and though it carried hardship, it also carried a certain sameness that felt eternal. The villages were clusters of timber and stone houses, thatched roofs darkened with age, smoke rising in slow spirals from open hearths. A single road might pass through the settlement, rutted with cart tracks and damp with rain. In the morning, animals stirred, cows lowed, chickens clucked, dogs barked, and children chased each other barefoot in the mud. The smell of baking bread drifted from ovens, mixing with the scent of damp straw and the sharper tang of manure. This was ordinary life, repeated endlessly, so ordinary that it seemed it might never change. Beyond the villages lay towns, enclosed with stout walls or wooden palisades. A town might boast a marketplace where stalls were crowded with grain sacks, bolts of cloth, barrels of salted fish, and baskets of onions. Merchants shouted their wares, while jugglers entertained for coins. The richer towns had guild halls where craftsmen gathered, and inns where travellers rested. Life here felt larger, faster, more connected to distant places, for towns lay on roads that carried trade, gossip, and news from afar. At the heart of these towns, churches rose above the rooftops. Stone towers and pointed spires stretched toward the sky, their bells marking the hours of prayer. The church was not merely a building, it was the centre of life. Its rituals guided the calendar: feast days, fast days, holy days. Its teachings coloured the thoughts of the living, its graveyards received the bodies of the dead. No corner of daily life lay beyond its reach. In times of joy or grief, people turned to it, believing it bound earth and heaven together. Yet beneath this surface of rhythm and order, the world was already restless. Far away, caravans crossed the deserts of Asia, laden with silks, spices, and treasures unknown to most Europeans. Ships set sail across the Mediterranean, bringing goods from Constantinople, Alexandria, and ports beyond. Traders spoke of wonders: cities with golden domes, markets overflowing with goods, armies stretching for miles. Europe was not cut off, though the distances were long. It was connected by fragile threads of trade, and these threads carried not only wealth, but also hidden dangers. The early 14th century was also marked by struggle. Wars smouldered between kingdoms. Borders shifted with battles, and fields that should have grown grain were trampled by soldiers' boots. Famine had struck not long before the plague arrived. Years of poor harvests left the soil exhausted, the barns bare, and the people hungry. Tales spread of parents feeding bark and grass to children, of villages abandoning fields, of people walking miles to find bread. Though the famine eased, its memory lingered in the bones of those who survived. Life expectancy was not long. Illnesses that we brush aside today could claim lives then. Fevers, infections, wounds that refused to heal, all could end a story too soon. Childbirth was dangerous, winters were hard, and hunger was never far away. Still, people endured. They found comfort in family, in tradition, in faith, and in the small joys of ordinary days. A loaf of fresh bread, a jug of ale shared among friends, the laughter of children playing at dusk, these things made life bearable, even when hardship pressed close. The nobility lived differently. Their castles stood on hills, surrounded by walls and moats. Within, lords and ladies held feasts, their tables set with roasted meats, spiced wine, and music played on lutes. They hunted in forests, rode in armour, and commanded peasants who worked the land. Yet even here, the air of permanence was an illusion. Castles might look eternal, but they too were vulnerable to war, to hunger, and, though they did not yet know it, to sickness carried silently across oceans and continents. Medicine was simple, guided by the teachings of ancient scholars. Physicians studied the works of Galen and Hippocrates, believing that the balance of humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, governed health. Treatments might involve bleeding, purging, or herbal remedies. Astrology was often consulted, for the alignment of stars was thought to influence the body. Though their knowledge was limited, people trusted in these methods, for they had little else. Illness was seen not only as a natural occurrence, but often as a punishment, a test, or a mystery of God's will. The landscape itself shaped life. Roads were slow and often dangerous, haunted by bandits or wolves. Travel was rare for common folk, though some pilgrims walked great distances to holy sites, seeking blessings or miracles. Cities like Paris, Florence, and London swelled with people, yet sanitation was poor. Waste was tossed into streets, animals wandered freely, and the crowded conditions made sickness easy to spread. But to those living in it, this was simply how the world was, ordinary, unquestioned, and accepted. The hum of life before the plague was steady, yet fragile. It was a balance held together by the rhythms of work, prayer, trade, and family. No one imagined that balance could collapse so suddenly. The memory of famine was still close, but famine was a slow thing, creeping in with poor harvests and lingering hunger. The calamity that was to come would not creep. It would arrive with speed, with silence, and with shadows that spread from town to town before anyone fully understood what was happening. Yet for now, before the pestilence, the world carried on. Farmers planted seed with quiet hope, artisans shaped wood and metal with practiced hands, scholars copied manuscripts by candlelight, and children grew, played, and dreamed. The days were long, the nights were dark, and the years rolled forward in their usual rhythm. The people lived in a world that felt permanent, a world that seemed as though it had always been and always would be. They could not know that the fragile thread of their existence was already trembling. In distant lands, far beyond the sight of Europe's villages, changes were stirring. Along the trade routes that crossed the steppes and deserts, stories began to spread of sickness in the east. Merchants whispered of sudden deaths, of swelling lumps, of fevers that burned like fire. But such stories seemed distant, as if they belonged to another world. The villages of Europe still woke to the crowing of roosters and the tolling of bells, unaware that the shadow of pestilence was already on the move. It is easy now to imagine the people of this time standing on the edge of a great abyss, though they themselves saw nothing. To them, life was as it had always been, hard, simple, fragile, yet continuous. They carried water, they sowed fields, they knelt in prayer, they sang songs at weddings and whispered goodbyes at gravesides. The rhythm of their days was the rhythm of centuries. And as the sun rose and set over the quiet fields, no one knew that the balance was about to be broken. The world before the pestilence was a world poised in silence. A silence of ordinary life, of continuity, of simple joys and enduring hardships. That silence would not last. But for a moment, in those years before the Black Death arrived, it was a silence that seemed eternal. The rhythm of daily life in the villages of Europe carried on in quiet repetition. Yet far beyond the familiar fields and churches, other journeys were unfolding across vast landscapes. To the east stretched roads older than kingdoms, winding through deserts, mountains, and endless steppes. Upon them moved caravans, long lines of camels, horses, and wagons, carrying goods from distant places toward the ports and markets that connected one world to another. These were the arteries of commerce, and though they seemed steady and enduring, they also carried things unseen, travelling as silently as the wheels that turned in the dust. The Silk Road was not one road, but many, a web of paths stretching across Asia, linking China, India, Persia, and the lands of the Mediterranean. For centuries, it had carried treasures, silk woven with care, spices that flavoured food with fire and fragrance, gems that caught the light, and knowledge written on fragile paper. Along with merchants came pilgrims, envoys, and wanderers, each drawn by trade, faith, or curiosity. At rest stops and caravanserais, strangers sat side by side, sharing stories in languages that blended together under starlit skies. The roads carried not only goods, but also ideas, hopes, and rumours. Yet woven into these exchanges were less welcome passengers. Fleas clung to the fur of rats hiding in grain sacks. Invisible sickness lingered in lungs, waiting for the chance to leap from one body to another. The great caravans, though steady and slow, were bridges between worlds. As they moved westward, they carried with them more than silk and spice. They carried a quiet shadow. The roads themselves were long and harsh. Caravans trudged through deserts where the sun scorched the earth and nights froze the skin. Winds blew sand into eyes and mouths, and water was more precious than gold. In mountain passes, paths narrowed between cliffs and ravines, where snow lingered and avalanches threatened. Bandits lurked, waiting for the chance to strike. Yet still the caravans pressed on, drawn by profit, necessity, and the promise of reaching another market where goods would fetch a high price. In the cities that dotted these routes, life bustled with energy. Samarkand, Bukhara, and other trading centres glittered with markets where traders from China, Persia, Arabia, and Europe gathered. Spices perfumed the air, fabrics shimmered in the sun, and gold coins clinked as deals were struck. These cities were crossroads, vibrant with exchange, but also fragile in their crowdedness. To enter such a place was to enter a whirl of sound and colour, yet also to risk contact with strangers carrying unseen afflictions. The Mongol Empire had stretched across much of Asia not long before, and though its armies had left scars of fire and conquest, they also opened routes once dangerous with rival tribes and warring states. Under their rule, merchants found safer passage, and goods flowed more freely. But the same openness that made trade flourish also made the spread of sickness inevitable. For where armies marched and merchants travelled, so too did diseases follow, finding new hosts along the way. From the perspective of the caravan driver, guiding his camels, the journey was routine. He had seen the same stretches of desert many times, heard the same creak of wheels, felt the same exhaustion in his bones. At night, he lay beneath the stars, listening to the murmur of fellow travellers, his animals resting nearby. He could not know that within the sacks of grain tied to his wagons, rats shifted quietly, their fleas carrying something deadly. To him, it was only another journey, another path to another city, the same as countless before. The goods these caravans carried were destined to reach the Mediterranean and beyond. Spices would season the food of noble households, silks would be worn by queens, and rare stones would adorn crowns. But alongside these treasures, a pestilence made its way westward, slow but certain, hidden in fur, in blood, and in the quiet breath of those already sick. Each step of the caravan, each mile crossed, brought it closer to places where no one yet imagined its existence. The rhythm of the caravans was patient. A day's march covered little ground, for animals needed rest, and men needed water. Fires were lit at night, and guards watched for thieves. At dawn, they moved again, dust rising in low clouds that clung to the legs of camels and horses. It was in this slowness that the pestilence travelled, unnoticed, unremarked upon, steady as the turning of the earth. In distant villages along the routes, people began to notice strange sicknesses. A merchant fell ill and did not rise. A family sickened after welcoming travellers. Small signs, scattered and uncertain, barely whispered among the greater noise of life. For sickness was not unusual, and death was no stranger. Few saw a pattern, and fewer still could imagine that what clung to these caravans would one day sweep across continents. The silent caravans reached ports where ships waited to sail. Rats scampered from wagons to docks, from docks to holds of vessels. Grain stored for journeys became a haven for them. As the sails caught the wind and ships departed, the shadow spread further, now carried not only by land but also by sea. Still, no one saw it clearly. To the sailors, it was only another voyage, another season of trade. The idea that within their ships rode something far more deadly than storms was beyond their imagining. The roads and the caravans were indifferent. They had carried many things before and would carry many after. Empires had risen and fallen along these paths. Armies had marched, and merchants had profited. The pestilence that now travelled with them was just another presence, hidden in the dust, waiting. Its silence was its strength. Unlike armies, it made no noise. Unlike merchants, it asked for no coin. It moved without being seen, patient, inevitable, bound for places unprepared for its arrival. And so the caravans pressed westward, their shadows lengthening as the sun set over deserts and steppes. In Europe, the bells still tolled, the markets still bustled, and the fields still swayed with grain. The people went about their lives, believing the world to be steady and known, yet far away, on roads most of them would never see, the pestilence drew closer, carried in silence by the very networks that linked one world to another. The caravans moved on, their animals laden with goods, their drivers weary but determined, their paths stretching endlessly before them. They were part of a great web of movement, one that bound together distant lands into a fragile unity. Within that unity lay the seeds of catastrophe, though no one yet recognized it. The roads bore the weight of treasures and of doom alike, carrying both toward a Europe that still slept in the illusion of permanence. The world before the pestilence was still intact, but on those ancient roads, in the silence of the caravans, the shadow had begun its long, quiet journey. In the lands beyond the familiar horizons of Europe, far along the routes where caravans moved slowly across steppes and deserts, stories began to surface. They were carried in the mouths of traders, woven into the conversations of pilgrims, and passed in hushed tones by sailors resting in foreign ports. The words were not loud, not yet warnings, but whispers, fragile, uncertain, and easily dismissed. They spoke of a strange sickness in distant towns, a fever that came without mercy, a swelling of the body, and sudden death. These whispers were not written in books or recorded in the Chronicles of Kings. They passed instead in taverns, in marketplaces, and at the edges of campfires. A merchant from one province told another of villages emptied overnight. A soldier returning from campaign muttered of comrades who had fallen without wound or battle. A sailor spoke of ports where the air seemed heavy with fear. To those who listened, these were tales of faraway lands, curious but not urgent, belonging to places most would never see. The East, to the imagination of medieval Europe, was a place of wonder and mystery. It was the land of silk and porcelain, of spices that flavoured food and incense that perfumed churches. Its cities were thought vast and glittering, filled with treasures unknown to the West. Alongside this fascination ran an undercurrent of unease. The East was also a place of strangeness, of unfamiliar customs, of powers and peoples whose ways seemed alien. To hear that something dark was stirring there only added to the sense of distance. It was troubling, but also abstract, like hearing thunder on a horizon too far to touch. Yet the whispers kept spreading. They moved with merchants into the bazaars of Central Asia, where stalls overflowed with goods and strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder. They lingered in caravanserais, where travellers rested for the night, each bringing news of the roads they had travelled. In these gatherings, words crossed languages, stories shifted in the telling, but the thread of fear remained. Something was moving through the East, something neither sword nor shield could resist. In the courts of rulers, the news arrived more slowly, wrapped in reports carried by envoys. Officials might hear of strange mortality among subjects, of fields left untended, of markets growing quiet. At first, these were treated as ordinary troubles. Empires had faced famine, revolt, and disease before. Such things were part of life's cycle, unwelcome but familiar. Few imagined that this was something larger, something that would not remain contained. The sickness itself was not yet fully understood. In towns along the routes, people saw neighbours fall ill with sudden fevers, their bodies come marked by swellings the size of eggs or apples. Some coughed blood and grew weak within days. Death came swiftly, often before families could summon help. Entire households fell silent, their doors closed, their windows shuttered. To those who survived, it seemed like a curse, a punishment descending without warning. Priests offered prayers, physicians searched for remedies, but the shadow grew regardless. For those who carried the whispers westwards, the stories were troubling, but not entirely new. Plagues had always existed in some form. Smallpox, leprosy, fevers of many kinds. These had troubled humanity for centuries. So when word spread of a new illness far away, it was received with curiosity, but not always alarm. Few could imagine that this particular sickness would travel further than any before it, crossing mountains, seas, and kingdoms to reach lands that still felt safe in their distance. The whispers also mingled with rumour and imagination. Some said the sickness came from foul winds, carried across the steppe by storms. Others said it was the result of poisoned wells or cursed waters. A few believed it was a punishment sent by heaven for sins too great to ignore. Explanations varied with each telling, for people tried to fit the unknown into patterns they understood. In the telling and retelling, the truth became blurred, yet the fear remained clear. In small villages along the trade routes, these stories were not distant tales, but lived reality. Families locked their doors, hoping to keep sickness away. Markets grew thinner as people avoided crowds. Funeral processions wound quietly through streets, bells tolling more often than before. In some places, whole communities vanished, leaving behind empty houses and overgrown fields. For the travellers who passed through, these sights were sobering, but they did not linger. Their lives were built on movement, and so they moved on, carrying their goods, and the whispers, to the next place. The East, vast and varied, was not a single land but many. From China to Persia, from the steppes to the cities, the shadows spread in uneven waves. Some places suffered early, others later, but the roads ensured that no region remained untouched. Every mile of road, every port where ships docked, every marketplace where strangers met became a point of contact, a link in the chain that drew the pestilence outward. The disease itself did not move with intention. It spread through the simplest of means: a flea's bite, a cough in the air, a body weakened by hunger. Yet through these small and ordinary acts, it grew into a force larger than any army. By the time the whispers reached the edges of Europe, they were already layered with fear and exaggeration. Some claimed entire cities had been destroyed, their populations wiped out overnight. Others said fields lay unploughed for years, and roads were littered with unburied dead. These stories, half believed, were received with unease, but distance dulled their urgency. To many in Europe, the East was always a place of strange and terrible tales. Few paused to consider that this story would not remain distant, that the road the merchants travelled was also the road the pestilence followed. The whispers were often dismissed as gossip, yet beneath the dismissal lay a quiet recognition of vulnerability. Those who heard them might look at their crowded streets and wonder, briefly, how their own towns would fare if such a sickness arrived. Then life resumed, markets reopened, and the routine of work continued. Fear was fleeting, and the comfort of familiarity returned quickly. The human mind, after all, prefers to believe that catastrophe belongs elsewhere, that the troubles of distant lands will not reach its own doorstep. Still, the whispers persisted. They wove themselves into the background of daily life, faint but constant. A merchant at an inn might mention them over a jug of wine. A sailor might recall them while waiting for the tide. A pilgrim might mutter them as a cautionary tale to fellow travellers. The words travelled further than anyone realised, riding invisibly alongside the goods, crossing borders without passports, and embedding themselves in the fabric of conversation. And with each whisper came the reality it hinted at. In the East, the pestilence deepened. Villages emptied, cities faltered, and rulers struggled to bury the dead. The sickness showed no respect for rank or wealth. Nobles and peasants alike succumbed. Temples filled with prayers, physicians bled patients in vain, and the toll of the bells grew relentless. The shadow moved westward, not because of rumour, but because of the ceaseless movement of trade and life itself. The whispers were only its faint echoes, arriving ahead of its true presence. The roads continued to carry caravans, and the seas continued to bear ships. Life pressed on with its familiar rhythm, but beneath that rhythm was a growing tension. Invisible, yet certain, the whispers from the East were not mere tales. They were the first stirrings of a storm that would cross continents, altering the course of history. In Europe, the fields were still green, the towns still lively, and the bells still rang with ordinary routine. But the voices carried from afar told of a world beginning to tremble, and though most did not yet know it, the tremor would soon reach them. The story of the Black Plague was already unfolding, even before it touched the shores of Europe. It began in the quiet words of travellers, in the uncertain warnings of strangers, in the murmurs that slipped through markets and ports. These whispers, faint as they were, marked the approach of a calamity unlike any other. A calamity that travelled not with shouts or banners, but with silence, shadows, and the ordinary movements of human life. The sea, like the land, carried its own endless rhythm. Waves rose and fell without pause. Tides pulled quietly at harbours, and sails swelled with the wind as they had for centuries. Along the Mediterranean, ships slipped in and out of ports, their hulls heavy with grain, spices, silks and timber. The creak of wood, the slap of water against the sides, the cries of gulls circling above, all of it was familiar, ordinary, part of a pattern as old as memory. Yet it was upon these same ships that shadows travelled, silent and unseen, bound for places that still believed themselves safe. The harbours of the 14th century were places of energy and noise. Dockworkers shouted as they hauled ropes and cargo. Merchants argued over prices, their words mixing with the clang of hammers repairing ships and the bleating of animals being loaded into holds. Children darted through the crowds, and the air was thick with the smell of tar, fish, and salt. To stand on a pier was to feel the whole world converge. Goods from distant lands, faces of strangers, stories of storms survived or voyages lost. It was also here, in the dark corners of the ships, that stowaways thrived. Rats scurried along beams and gnawed through sacks of grain. They nested in coils of rope, slipped between barrels, and multiplied unseen in the shadows. Their presence was not unusual. Sailors had always battled them, trapping and killing when they could, though never fully eradicating them. But these rats carried more than hunger and teeth. On their backs and in their fur lived fleas, and within those fleas dwelled something far more dangerous, a sickness that had begun its slow crawl westward along the trade routes. When ships left the ports of the Black Sea, they carried not only goods, but also this hidden burden. The voyage across the Mediterranean was long, marked by days of steady winds and sudden storms. Sailors mended sails, steered by the stars, and passed the hours with stories, songs, and silence. They did not know that among them sickness waited. Some coughed without warning, some grew weak and pale, and soon the cramped quarters became a place of fear. At sea, there was no escape. A ship was a world unto itself, and when death entered that world, it touched every corner. Ports like Constantinople, Messina, Genoa, and Venice were among the first to feel the shadow. Ships arrived as they always did, sails furled, anchors dropped, and cargo unloaded. But along with the goods came something unseen. Dock workers who carried barrels fell ill. Merchants who examined cargo began to cough. Families who welcomed sailors home soon found themselves burying them. The sickness spread not with shouts, but with quiet inevitability, seeping into streets and houses until the sound of bells tolling for the dead became more frequent than the chatter of the markets. The ships themselves bore grim signs. Sailors sometimes died before they reached land, their bodies cast into the sea with hurried prayers. Others staggered off the gangplanks, pale and trembling, only to collapse days later in crowded alleys. The arrival of a ship, once a cause for bustling trade and expectation, became instead a source of dread. Rumours spread quickly that death came from the harbours, that the sea was delivering more than cargo, that each new arrival brought another wave of sickness. Yet even as fear grew, trade did not cease. The world depended on the movement of goods. Grain needed to be shipped to feed cities, cloth and spices fueled commerce, and no port could simply close itself entirely. Merchants hoped that the sickness was fleeting, that it would pass as other illnesses had passed before. So the ships kept coming, docking in harbours across the Mediterranean, each one carrying with it a chance of survival for some, and the certainty of ruin for others. The sea gave the pestilence speed that land alone could not. Caravans were slow, trudging across deserts and mountains. Ships, with favourable winds, could carry the sickness hundreds of miles in days. From the Black Sea, vessels reached the heart of Europe's coasts with startling swiftness. Towns that had never heard the whispers from the east now found themselves facing death directly, their streets filled with silence where markets once rang with life. Life on the ships themselves became marked by superstition. Sailors feared the unseen breath of their companions. Some whispered prayers to ward off evil winds. Others carried charms against sickness. Yet nothing seemed to stop the spread once it began. The close quarters, the shared food and water, the lack of space, all made a ship a perfect vessel for pestilence. When it reached land, it found crowded cities waiting, places where people lived side by side, where waste and filth made the air heavy, and where fear travelled faster than any rat or flea. The harbours, once lively with laughter and bargaining, grew uneasy. Priests walked the docks offering blessings, though many hesitated to approach ships. Officials debated how to protect their cities, some ordering ships to remain at anchor, others burning cargo in desperate attempts to cleanse it. But fear could not undo what had already arrived. Once the sickness entered a city, it moved from house to house, neighbour to neighbour until the bells rang without pause. The sea, indifferent as always, carried ships onward. From port to port, the shadow leapt, riding the currents, carried on wooden decks and woven sails. Fishermen still cast their nets, traders still sought profit, pilgrims still boarded vessels bound for holy sites. Each journey added another thread to the web that drew the pestilence deeper into Europe. It spread not with the roar of storms, but with the quiet certainty of tides, inevitable, steady, unstoppable. In some harbours, entire fleets were feared. Ships seen on the horizon brought not joy, but dread, as people wondered what sickness their arrival would unleash. Some communities barred entry, but rats and fleas needed no permission to disembark. They slipped down ropes, scurried through warehouses, and found new homes in the alleys and barns of the cities. The sickness followed them, silent as ever, indifferent to laws and walls. The ships that carried shadows were ordinary, no different in design from countless others that had sailed for centuries. Their timbers groaned, their sails billowed, their crews worked tirelessly to keep them afloat. Yet within their holds and among their passengers, they bore something extraordinary in its devastation. They were unwitting messengers of death, moving along the natural currents of trade and necessity, leaving behind silence where once there had been life. The Mediterranean, glittering beneath the sun, became the stage upon which this unseen drama unfolded. Ports that had thrived for generations now trembled with fear. Families that had lived for centuries in bustling harbours now found their homes emptied, their streets quiet, but for the tolling of bells. The very lifeline that had enriched Europe, that had brought it goods and ideas from faraway lands, now brought with it a shadow that threatened to unravel all that had been built. And still, the ships came, one after another, their sails white against the horizon, their hulls dark with age and salt. They moved steadily, indifferent to the terror they carried. The sea accepted them, the wind drove them, and the harbours received them. In their wake, cities faltered, villages emptied, and the fragile rhythm of life that had seemed eternal began to collapse. The ships that brought shadows left no record of intention. They were not designed to harm, nor did their crews wish to spread death. Yet through their ordinary work, through the simple act of sailing from one port to another, they became the carriers of humanity's greatest calamity. They were part of the endless motion of the world, the ceaseless exchange of goods and lives that had bound continents together. But in their holds, hidden among grain and rope, nestled in fur, and carried in breath, they bore a shadow that no one could escape. The first signs were often quiet ones. A dock worker who slumped against the barrel, too weak to lift the next load. A merchant who coughed through his negotiations and never returned to the market the following day. A sailor who stumbled down the gangplank, pale, unsteady and fevered. The harbours that had long been the pulse of cities soon became uneasy places. The air of commerce and chatter was interrupted by whispers, then silence, then the tolling of bells. Messina, perched on the coast of Sicily, felt the shadow most suddenly. Ships arrived carrying not only goods, but men already sickened, their faces marked by strange swellings, their bodies shaking with fever. The townspeople, curious at first, gathered at the docks to greet the arrivals. Curiosity turned to horror, as illness spread almost immediately, striking those who had been closest. Within days, the bustling port that had welcomed traders and travellers for generations fell into confusion. Doors closed, families shut themselves inside. Priests walked the narrow streets with hurried steps, carrying the last rites to one house after another. The sound of carts soon replaced the shouts of merchants. Wooden wheels groaned under the weight of bodies being carried to burial grounds. At first, the earth received them in orderly graves, but the pace quickened, and soon there was no time for care. Trenches were dug, hastily filled, and dug again. The harbour, once alive with the colours of sails and banners, stood in eerie stillness. Rats scurried unchecked along the docks, slipping between warehouses, carrying the unseen plague deeper into the city. Fear spread faster than the sickness itself. Some tried to flee inland, believing distance could shield them. But the sickness followed. Others clung to rituals, prayers, processions, offerings, hoping divine mercy might spare them. Yet the bells tolled on, each note heavy in the air, until it seemed the city's very heart was beating in grief. Messina, once a vibrant link between sea and land, became a place of silence and suspicion. From Sicily, the shadow did not remain contained. Trade demanded movement, and ships did not cease their journeys. Genoa and Venice, proud and wealthy, found themselves receiving the same burden. Their harbours had been symbols of strength, gateways through which wealth poured into Europe. But with each arriving vessel, more sickness disembarked. Sailors stumbled into taverns, merchants carried goods through narrow streets, dock workers hauled barrels into crowded warehouses, and the pestilence slipped among them all. Venice, a city built on water, was especially vulnerable. Its canals, once alive with the hum of daily life, reflected a strange stillness as families shuttered their windows. Gondoliers hesitated to take passengers, fearing the invisible threat. The great markets, once crowded with buyers, thinned to a trickle of frightened faces. Officials tried measures born of desperation, burning contaminated goods, isolating the sick, even turning away ships. Yet the sickness was already inside, spreading silently from neighbour to neighbour, house to house. The port itself took on a haunted air. The cranes that once unloaded bales of silk and sacks of spice now stood still. The air smelled not only of salt and fish, but of smoke from hurried pyres. Rats, undisturbed, scampered boldly through the alleys, their fleas leaping from one host to another, carrying with them the unseen terror. Bells rang so often they no longer startled, but merged with the very sound of life, an unending echo of loss. In Genoa, fear took hold with the same swiftness. The harbour that had seen generations of proud merchant ships became the stage of mourning. Families barricaded themselves, yet the sickness found its way in. Stories told of sudden collapse, of swellings that blackened the flesh, of fevers that consumed within days. Physicians, armed with little more than herbs and prayers, moved helplessly through the streets. Some prescribed fumigation, others recommended the carrying of sweet-smelling flowers, but none could halt the shadow. The more bodies fell, the more the living withdrew. Markets emptied, ships hesitated to dock, and still the pestilence spread. The great harbours that had once seemed like veins of prosperity now pulsed with death, each ship a carrier, each street an artery through which the sickness flowed. From Italy, the shadow leapt outward. Marseille felt its grip, then Pisa, then farther along the coasts of France and Spain. The pattern was the same. A ship on the horizon, sails bright in the sunlight, approaching with the promise of goods and profit. Then within days, the promise turned to despair. A few dead at first, then many, then too many to count. Ports that had been the pride of their regions became feared entryways of ruin, and yet, despite the terror, the rhythm of trade could not entirely stop. Grain was still needed, salt was still essential, merchants still sought to salvage what they could. Ships continued to cross the seas, though more hesitantly, more quietly. Some captains ordered their vessels anchored offshore, afraid of being denied entry. Others slipped into harbours at night, hoping to unload before fear could rise. In every case, the unseen passengers came with them, spilling into streets, homes, and lives. The transformation of the ports was not only physical, but deeply human. Where once laughter had echoed across taverns and warehouses, silence lingered. Where once ships' bells marked arrivals, now the tolling bells marked only departures of another kind. Families walked together to burial grounds and returned fewer in number. Children's games faded from courtyards. The very air seemed heavy, as if the cities themselves mourned. Authorities struggled to respond. Some imposed measures that would, in time, become the foundations of quarantine. Ships were ordered to remain anchored for days, sometimes weeks, before unloading. Suspected households were locked and marked. Guards were stationed at city gates, turning away travellers. But such measures, though desperate and occasionally effective, often came too late. The pestilence had already taken root, spreading with a relentlessness that no decree could stop. The ports that once symbolised connection to the world now became symbols of vulnerability. The sea that had brought wealth now delivered devastation. The very openness that had made these cities strong, their trade, their commerce, their welcome of strangers, now became their greatest weakness. The awakening of the ports was not a single event, but a slow realisation, a dawning terror that grew with each day's losses. People began to understand that what had arrived was not a passing sickness, but something vast, something that seemed to stretch across borders and seas alike. It was not bound by language or law, not hindered by walls or gates. It flowed as freely as trade itself, leaving behind only silence. Yet even in the shadow, life persisted. Some continued to fish, to farm, to sail. Bells tolled, but children still clung to their mothers, lovers still held hands in fear, prayers still rose in smoky chapels. The ports, though wounded, did not vanish. They endured, scarred and changed, but alive. And in their endurance, they became the first places to witness not only the terror of the plague, but the resilience that would one day outlast it. For now, though, the harbours stood as gateways of dread. Each incoming vessel seemed a herald of sorrow. Each outgoing tide carried whispers of loss to the next coast. The sea remained beautiful in its glittering indifference, The ship still rose and fell with the waves, but beneath it all, the world knew that the ports had awakened, not to wealth, not to trade, but to death itself. The first days were marked by confusion, but confusion soon gave way to silence. Cities that had once roared with voices, markets and movement began to sound different. The rhythm of life shifted. Where once the cries of merchants filled the morning air, now the slow, heavy toll of church bells dominated the hours. Each note was drawn out. Each vibration seemed to linger in the air, as though unwilling to fade, and the people listened with dread. For the bells had become not signals of time, nor celebrations of feast days, but markers of death. It began with the smallest changes. A tavern door remained closed when it should have been open. The baker's stall at the edge of the square sat empty, its shelves bare. Neighbours who once greeted each other at dawn now kept their distance, eyes averted, footsteps quick. Streets that had been woven with laughter, bargaining and song began to stretch out long and hollow, their cobblestones echoing the few hurried feet that dared tread them. As sickness deepened, the bells tolled with greater frequency. They rang for the old, the young, the strong, the weak. No one was spared. Families huddled behind wooden shutters, listening to the sound drifting over rooftops. At first, each ring could be matched with a name, a face remembered in grief. Soon the names were too many. The bells seemed to toll endlessly, a sound without beginning or end, carrying with it the weight of countless losses. In narrow alleys, once crowded with children at play, silence reigned. Only the shuffle of priests remained, their robes brushing against stone walls as they carried sacred words to the dying. Their voices were muffled, nearly swallowed by the stillness, as though the very air had grown heavy with sorrow. Even dogs that had once chased through the squares wandered slowly now, their ribs showing, their eyes searching for scraps in places where no hands remained to feed them. Markets withered. Stalls once brimming with fruit and spices now stood deserted, cloth awnings flapping in the wind. The vibrant scent of life, oranges, bread, herbs, was replaced by the sharp tang of smoke from hurried fires meant to cleanse the air, and the unmistakable, suffocating odour of decay. Goods lay abandoned where merchants had dropped them, uncollected, unwanted. The world of trade and bargaining had dissolved into something unfamiliar. The bells gave the only rhythm. They tolled in the morning, in the afternoon, in the dead of night. They rang so often that the sound wove itself into dreams, blurring the boundary between waking and sleeping. For some, the bells became unbearable. They pressed their hands to their ears, as if to shut out the reminder. For others, they were the last fragile link to faith, each ring a prayer rising into the heavens. But whether comfort or torment, the bells never ceased. Carts rolled slowly through the emptier streets, their wooden wheels creaking against stone. At first they were driven by men who called out for the dead, urging families to bring forth their lost. But as days stretched into weeks, even the voices of the collectors faded. Now the carts moved in near silence, piled high, leaving behind only the smell of lime and freshly dug earth. The bells tolled, the carts passed, and the streets grew emptier. Houses that had once been full of warmth and conversation stood shuttered and still. Curtains drawn, fires gone cold. Some families vanished entirely, their homes left frozen as though waiting for return. Tables remained set, cups half filled, chairs pulled away, as if life had paused mid-breath. Neighbours whispered of households where no one stirred, where the silence was so complete it seemed the walls themselves mourned. Churchyards overflowed, graves were dug hastily, earth piled high beside trenches that stretched longer each day. There was no space, no time, no ceremony. What had once been a sacred passage of life now became hurried necessity. The bells tolled, priests prayed as quickly as lips could form the words, and earth covered all. Yet still the dead came. The emptiness of the streets took on a strange presence of its own. Without the hum of daily life, every sound grew louder. The flap of a bird's wings, the whisper of wind, the drip of water from a rooftop. People began to speak less, as though their voices might awaken something best left sleeping. Doors creaked open cautiously and closed quickly again. Human voices, once the dominant sound of the city, grew rare, replaced entirely by the slow, measured toll of bells. Fear gave birth to its own rituals. Some carried sprigs of herbs, pressing them to their noses with each step. Others burned incense in their homes, filling the air with smoke in hopes it might keep sickness at bay. Processions formed at times, led by those who believed devotion alone could banish the plague, their chants rising in the dim light of evening. Yet these processions dwindled as quickly as they began, the voices of the faithful falling silent one by one, until only the bells remained to sing. In some quarters, the emptiness was broken only by the appearance of masked figures, physicians clad in long robes, faces hidden by the curved beaks of their strange masks. They moved slowly, cautiously, like shadows drifting through the streets. Children peered at them from shutter cracks, their strange appearance etched forever in frightened memories. But even these physicians, armed with pouches of herbs and long sticks to keep distance, could not halt the tolling of bells. Night deepened the silence. Where once taverns had glowed with laughter and firelight, their windows now stood dark, doors barred. The laughter of evenings, the songs of travellers, the clatter of cups, all gone. Instead, the sound of bells carried through the darkness, sometimes close, sometimes faint, drifting across rooftops, echoing in empty courtyards. The bells did not sleep. Travellers entering the cities felt the change instantly. They described the hush, the absence of life, the way footsteps echoed as though magnified by the emptiness. They told of streets where not a soul stirred, yet the feeling of presence lingered, as if unseen eyes watched from behind shuttered windows. They spoke of how the bells seemed to follow them wherever they went, a sound that could not be escaped. And still, amid the silence, life persisted in fragments. A mother whispering lullabies to her child, though her own voice trembled. A baker who continued to knead dough each dawn, offering bread to whoever dared approach. A bell ringer climbing weary steps, pulling the rope with tired hands, marking the passing of another soul. These small moments of defiance against despair glimmered faintly in the dark, though they too were often swallowed by silence. The emptiness was not only physical, but spiritual. People questioned the meaning of suffering, whispered doubts to one another. Was this punishment? Was it fate? Or was it simply an unseen force beyond comprehension? The bells tolled, and no answer came. Only the steady ringing, a reminder that the world was still turning, even as lives fell away like leaves in winter. In time, some streets became so still that nature began to reclaim them. Grass pushed through cracks in stone, ivy crept across abandoned walls, birds nested undisturbed. The human silence made space for other voices. Yet above them all, the bells still rang, carrying across both empty streets and overgrown corners, uniting the city in shared mourning. The cities no longer moved to the rhythm of work, trade, or festival. They moved to the rhythm of loss. The bells tolled in steady succession, each one heavy, each one final, until time itself seemed measured not in hours or days, but in the spaces between deaths. And so the streets remained, emptied of laughter, emptied of song, carrying only the echo of bells. Their sound, heavy and unrelenting, lingered not only in the air, but in the hearts of all who survived. It was the soundtrack of a world suspended between life and death, a reminder of fragility, and a whisper of endurance. For even as silence grew, even as the shadows deepened, the bells continued to ring, keeping alive the faint thread of memory, binding together a city that might otherwise have dissolved entirely into silence. The silence of the city spilled outward, carried by rumour and dread, until it reached the villages scattered across the countryside. Small hamlets, where life had always been measured by the toll of seasons and the rhythm of harvests, found themselves touched by the same dark current. News travelled not only by word of mouth, but in the sight of wagons creaking along the roads, filled not with grain or goods, but with the belongings of families who no longer dared remain in their homes. In those villages, fear arrived before the sickness itself. The peasants heard tales of bells tolling endlessly in the cities, of carts piled high with the dead, of priests chanting until their voices failed. The stories alone were enough to unsettle the fields. Farmers who once bent their backs to sow and reap began to glance over their shoulders as they worked. Shepherds abandoned pastures early, driving their flocks into pens and locking gates, as if a simple barrier of wood might keep away something unseen. The first signs were subtle. A cottage door closed and did not open for days. Smoke ceased to curl from a chimney where once it had risen each dawn. A family vanished without farewell, leaving behind tools scattered by the hearth and bread hardening on the table. At first, neighbours wondered, whispered, reassured themselves that perhaps they had gone to visit kin. But soon more doors stood shut, more chimneys lay cold, and suspicion grew heavy in the air. When the sickness finally came, it arrived quietly. A child fevered in the night. A father coughed blood into the straw by morning. A mother lay still by dusk. The village priest made his rounds, blessing each house, though even he began to keep a distance. And then, as the days passed, the pattern repeated in one hut after another. The people no longer doubted. The plague had reached their fields. Fear drove them to decisions once unthinkable. Entire households gathered what little they could carry and set out upon the roads, believing they might outrun the darkness if only they left quickly enough. Mothers tied bundles of clothing with trembling hands, fathers lifted children onto weary shoulders, and together they slipped away in the pale light of dawn. They did not look back, for to look upon the cottages was to risk seeing the shadows of those who would never follow. The roads filled with such wanderers. Lines of villagers, carrying their lives in sacks and baskets, moved silently across the countryside. They avoided one another, keeping distance even from those they once called neighbours. Each family became an island of fear, unwilling to share food, water, or touch. The bonds of community, woven over generations, frayed within weeks. All that remained was the hope that somewhere ahead there might be safety. But safety was an illusion. Villages along the way barred their gates, suspicious of any strangers. Travellers were turned away from inns and farmyards alike. The flight from one place only led to suspicion in another. At night, families huddled in the woods or by riverbanks, unwilling to risk knocking on doors that would never open. The sound of children crying was muffled against shawls, and fires were kept small, for light might draw unwelcome attention. Fields lay untended as more and more fled. Crops withered on their stalks, fruits dropped unpicked, weeds overtook furrows once carefully tended. The rhythm of agriculture, which had always held the villages steady, faltered. The earth itself seemed to fall silent, mirroring the emptiness of the cottages. Roads once used for trade now carried only the shuffle of frightened feet, the creak of carts laden with hurried belongings, and the occasional cough that made companions recoil in dread. Some chose a different path. Rather than flee, they locked themselves inside their homes, barricading windows and doors with whatever timber they could find. They stockpiled grain and salted meat, hoping the walls might hold back death if they simply waited long enough. These homes became islands of silence, their inhabitants peering out only rarely, watching others vanish down the road. Weeks later, neighbours spoke of these cottages as sealed tombs, for few ever reopened their doors. As the villages emptied, animals began to wander. Oxen strayed from abandoned yokes, dogs roamed without masters, chickens scratched aimlessly in dust where no hands came to scatter grain. In some places, wolves crept closer to the edges of fields, emboldened by the absence of people. The once orderly landscape of peasant life dissolved, replaced by a strange wildness, as though the land itself were reclaiming what had been taken. The flight was not always orderly. Some families fled so quickly that possessions were left behind entirely. Shoes were abandoned on thresholds. Cooking pots hung untouched over cold hearths. Prayers half finished, still marked on scraps of parchment. Others clung desperately to heirlooms. A carved chest, a silver cross, a quilt passed down through generations, even when the weight of such things slowed their escape. The roads bore witness to both kinds of choices, objects scattered in haste, and burdens carried stubbornly through exhaustion. Not everyone could flee. The elderly, the ill, the poorest of the poor often remained, watching as stronger neighbours disappeared over the horizon. For them, there was no road, no escape, only the slow tightening of fear. Their villages became hollow shells, with a few flickering lights in windows at night, their silence broken only by the sound of crows circling above. And still, even for those who fled, there was no true refuge. The plague moved as swiftly as rumour, reaching valleys, riversides, mountain hamlets. Travellers carried it unknowingly in their breath, their clothes, their fear. The very act of fleeing spread the shadow further, drawing it into places that might otherwise have been spared. The image of abandonment lingered in every village, carts left tilted in mud, ploughs half buried in fields, looms standing with unfinished cloth. Life paused mid-motion, as though the entire countryside had been caught in a single moment of flight. Even churches stood nearly empty, their candles burning low, their pews collecting dust. Only the wind moved freely through the open doors, carrying with it the faint scent of incense and decay. Those who took to the forests found themselves in a world that seemed both protective and threatening. Beneath the trees, families tried to build makeshift shelters, weaving branches and brush into crude huts. They listened to the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of animals, the sound of rivers flowing nearby. For a brief moment, some believed they had escaped into safety, hidden away from the sickness. Yet the same silence followed them there, the same fear of a cough in the night, the same toll of loss when one of their own failed to wake by morning. The movement from villages created not only emptiness but disorientation. Roads that had once been busy with carts of grain or herds of livestock became strange and unfamiliar. Travellers who had never left their hamlets now wandered for days, unsure of where the path might lead, unsure if they were walking toward refuge or simply into another circle of despair. Landmarks that once comforted, the bend of a river, the crest of a hill, the spire of a distant church, now filled them with unease. For each sign of civilization might just as easily be a place where the sickness had already struck. The countryside itself began to seem haunted. Abandoned mills stood silent beside still waters. Bridges carried no footsteps. Wells, once gathering places for gossip and laughter, stood unused, their buckets dry. The flight from villages left behind a landscape dotted with ghostly reminders of life interrupted. Travellers, glancing back at such scenes, carried them like shadows in their minds. Over time, the exodus created regions nearly devoid of people. Fields stretched empty, roads lay unused, villages sagged into disrepair. The very landscape seemed to mourn the absence of human presence. Yet in that silence, a strange resilience stirred. Grass grew tall where feet no longer trampled. Deer roamed where once children had played. Streams ran clear without the labour of mill wheels. Nature crept forward quietly, indifferent to the fear that consumed humankind. And so the flight continued, wave after wave, until the countryside seemed to blur with motion. Families drifting endlessly, villages hollowing out, landscapes shifting from cultivated to abandoned. Everywhere, the same question lingered in weary minds. Where could one go, when the sickness moved faster than the feet that fled it? The answer was never certain. Yet still they walked, still they carried, still they left behind the places that had once defined their lives. The villages, once the heartbeat of the land, became places of memory. Empty cottages, broken gates, fields gone wild, all stood as silent testimony to a time when life had paused, when fear had driven humanity from its own hearths, scattering them into the unknown. And through it all, the journey of flight continued, not towards safety, but deeper into the strange, unsettled stillness of a world remade by plague. The city had once been a place of restless noise. The clip-clop of horses against stone, the shouts of merchants boasting about their wares, the laughter of children darting through narrow alleys, and the constant hum of church bells marking the rhythm of life. But now, all of it seemed to have been swallowed by an invisible hand, leaving behind streets where echoes lingered longer than footsteps. The plague had arrived, and with it came not only sickness, but also a silence that felt heavier than any sound. At first the hush was subtle. A shop shuttered earlier than usual, a tavern door left closed on what should have been a lively evening, a church service cancelled because the priest himself had taken to his bed. But the subtle became permanent, and soon whole neighbourhoods looked like abandoned stages where the actors had vanished mid-play. Those who still dared to move outside did so quickly, with heads bowed and hands clutching herbs or talismans, hoping these small protections might keep the shadow of death at bay. What silence remained was not peaceful. It was punctuated by sounds that belonged only to plague-ridden cities. The groan of wagon wheels carrying the dead, the rattle of coughing that came from darkened windows, the occasional cry of grief that escaped from houses where families had sealed themselves inside with their sick. Bells tolled not to call the faithful to prayer, but to mark another soul's passing. And as the days stretched into weeks, their tolls became constant, dull notes merging into one long funeral song. Markets stood deserted, their stalls still bearing the remnants of goods no one dared to touch. A basket of apples browned in the sun until flies claimed them, and bolts of once bright cloth sagged under the weight of dust. The moneylenders, the fishmongers, the blacksmiths, all had retreated, leaving their crafts and livelihoods abandoned. Even thieves, who once thrived in crowded places, found little worth stealing, for the most precious possession anyone had was their fragile breath. Inside the city walls, the narrow houses pressed against one another like crowded coffins. Some were sealed shut from within, boards nailed across doors to prevent the sick from wandering out. Others had been locked from the outside, neighbours unwilling to take chances on those within. At night, the silence was broken by muffled cries for water or bread, followed by days of nothing, until the quiet claimed those voices as well. Animals moved where people no longer dared. Dogs, once faithful companions, prowled the streets untethered, their ribs visible as they searched for scraps. Cats leapt silently across rooftops, eyes glinting in the moonlight, as if the city now belonged to them. In some districts, pigs roamed free, feeding on refuse left behind. These creatures thrived where humans faltered, their sounds filling the void left by human absence. The wealthier families had fled before the silence became complete. Country estates, high mountain retreats, or walled villas became sanctuaries where they hoped the pestilence could not follow. Those who remained were often the poor, the artisans, the widows, and orphans. For them, there was nowhere to go. Their lives were bound to the narrow streets and the crumbling buildings, and the silence of the city became their inheritance. Churches once filled with worshippers became hushed tombs of incense and dust. Candles still burned before shrines, their flames trembling as if fearful of being extinguished by the sickness in the air. Priests, when they could be found, moved through the streets with weary steps, muttering prayers over bodies, or carrying the sacrament to those too weak to leave their beds. But many priests had also perished, leaving churches with doors open to the wind, their bells swaying without hands to ring them. The silence stretched into the very fabric of time. Days no longer carried the distinction they once did. A sunrise revealed only another day of absence, and a sunset brought another night of dread. The seasons themselves seemed uncertain, their natural rhythms overshadowed by the constant presence of death. What use was spring when fields went unplanted, or summer when no festivals filled the squares? Life itself seemed paused, as though the city were holding its breath and waiting for something that never arrived. Those who survived adapted to this stillness in different ways. Some walked with measured steps, moving quietly as though afraid to disturb the fragile quiet around them. Others spoke louder, perhaps to reassure themselves that sound still had power. Children, too young to grasp the weight of the silence, sometimes played in the streets, their laughter thin and fleeting before watchful parents pulled them back indoors. Every sound felt out of place, an intrusion on the hushed world that the plague had created. In the heart of the city, squares once alive with theatre, music, and commerce stood empty. Statues stared over bare cobblestones, pigeons perching on their heads where crowds once gathered. Fountains trickled, their waters untouched. Graffiti appeared on some walls, carved prayers or desperate messages left by hands that likely did not survive long enough to see them fade. The silence made these marks seem louder, each a small echo of human presence in an otherwise abandoned world. The most haunting part of the silence was its unpredictability. It could stretch endlessly, broken only by the wind whistling through alleyways, and then, without warning, a scream, a wail, or the hollow clang of a shovel burying earth would erupt and fade again. It was as if the city itself was reminding its inhabitants that beneath the quiet, suffering was still constant. The absence of noise was never true peace. It was a reminder of all that had been lost. As weeks turned into months, people began to fear the silence itself. It became a sign that death had passed through a household, leaving no one behind to cry, to sing, or to pray. A house that remained quiet for too long often drew the attention of officials or gravediggers, who would eventually break in to discover whether the family inside still lived. More often than not, they found only still forms, lying as though they had simply fallen asleep forever. For travellers approaching the city from the outside, the silence was the first thing they noticed. From a distance, cities were supposed to roar with life, the hammering of forges, the chatter of traders, the music of street performers. But here, the closer one came, the quieter the air grew, until even birds seemed to avoid flying over the walls. It was said that one could feel the silence pressing against the skin before even setting foot inside. There were those who tried to break the stillness. Musicians took to playing in the streets, their songs melancholy and short-lived, often silenced by illness. A few actors attempted performances in empty squares, reciting words into air that held no audience. But these efforts faded quickly, for the silence was stronger than any performance. It was not merely the absence of noise, it was the weight of collective fear and mourning, impossible to lift with melody or laughter. Yet beneath the silence, life stubbornly clung on. Midwives still delivered infants into a world hushed by death. Bakers, working in the secrecy of dawn, left loaves of bread on doorsteps before vanishing back inside. Neighbours passed buckets of water through windows without speaking, gestures of survival carried out wordlessly. In these small acts, the silence was not absolute. It was shaped by the quiet persistence of those who refused to surrender completely. The city, wrapped in silence, seemed suspended between worlds. Neither fully alive nor entirely dead, it lingered in a strange twilight where memory and mourning coexisted. It stood as a reminder that the plague did not simply take lives. It also reshaped the very sound of existence. And in that eerie quiet, the living walked as shadows among shadows, waiting for a time when the bells would toll for something other than death, and the streets would once again remember the music of human life. The silence of the city did not stop at its streets or its churches. It sank into the very heart of daily life, into the markets that had once been the pulse of every community. They had been places where people did not simply buy and sell, but where life itself was exchanged. News, gossip, laughter, and the comforting repetition of familiar voices calling out their wares. In those squares, one could measure the seasons by what was piled on the wooden stools. Fish laid fresh with glistening scales in spring. Baskets of cherries staining the fingers in summer. Cabbages stacked high in autumn. And salted meats carried in for the winter. The marketplace was where strangers became acquaintances, and where every family's table was shaped by the chatter of the day. But now the stones that had echoed with footsteps were bare. The stalls stood like skeletons of what they had been, wooden beams exposed to rain and sun, their coverings long since torn away by weather or neglect. The air that once carried the thick smells of bread, spices, and roasting meats now offered only the faint odour of dust, mixed at times with something sourer, the lingering reminder of too many bodies carried past in haste. There had been attempts to keep the markets open when the plague first arrived. Merchants, fearful of losing their livelihoods, spread their goods farther apart, keeping distance between one another. Buyers came cautiously, carrying cloths over their faces, fumbling coins into basins of vinegar before making exchanges. But as more traders disappeared, one after another, the stalls thinned. The cries that once rose together into a busy chorus became scattered, then rare, and then stopped altogether. Food did not vanish all at once. In the first weeks, bread still appeared, though loaves grew smaller and harder. Fishmongers came less often, their baskets lighter, their voices hoarse. The butchers closed their shops, and what little meat remained was guarded jealously. Grain supplies dwindled quickly, and soon rats, which once scavenged beneath the tables, multiplied freely, fattened on the scraps of an abandoned trade. With each passing day, the square became less of a place of living exchange, and more of a hollow stage, remembering the roles it once held. For those who wandered into the empty markets, the silence was almost unbearable. They found themselves standing still, staring at the outlines where baskets had once rested, at the hooks where cuts of meat once hung. It was not just hunger that drove people there. It was habit, memory, the sense that surely something of life must still remain in the familiar space. But the silence offered nothing. and the stones gave back only the echo of their footsteps. Some merchants had tried to adapt by leaving goods unattended, setting baskets at the edge of the square and stepping far back. Buyers would approach cautiously, drop coins into bowls of vinegar, and then take what they could. But trust eroded quickly. Too often, baskets were left uncollected or stolen outright. What had once been a place of open bargaining and communal reliance had become a place of suspicion, where even the simplest exchange was carried out like a crime. The absence of voices was felt most sharply by those who had lived their lives in rhythm with the market. Old women who had once spent their mornings choosing vegetables found their days unbearably long without the chatter of neighbours. Children who once chased each other through the crowd now sat idle in doorways, their games silenced by the emptiness. Even the beggars, who had relied on the generosity of those passing by, disappeared, either taken by the sickness or left with no one to beg from. In some places, notices were posted on walls, announcing attempts to move markets outside the city gates, where air might be fresher and contagion less concentrated. These new markets were quiet and tense, stripped of the joy and rhythm that had once defined them. Transactions became hurried gestures, coins and food exchanged with as little contact as possible. The cheerful shouts of bargaining were replaced by whispers, as though speaking too loudly might draw death itself nearer. The emptiness of the markets also changed the rhythm of the city. Without their daily gatherings, the flow of news slowed to a trickle. Rumours spread more erratically, fed by fear and imagination rather than conversation. Families lived enclosed in their own uncertainties, no longer grounded by the shared voice of the marketplace. The world outside seemed to shrink, until each household existed almost in isolation, knowing little of what lay beyond its own street. Yet the stones of the market held memory stubbornly. Even in their silence, they seemed to remember the bustle they had once contained. When the wind swept through the square, carrying a stray scrap of paper or the smell of rain, one might almost believe it carried echoes of laughter or a distant call to buy. Pigeons strutted on the abandoned stalls, as though mocking the absence of human voices, their coos the only sound rising in the air. Dogs padded through, sniffing where fish had once been dropped, tails wagging with a hope that was never fulfilled. Some tried to imagine the silence differently. Poets, still clinging to their craft, wrote verses about the abandoned squares, comparing them to seas suddenly drained of their water, ships stranded on the sand. They saw in the absence a kind of grim beauty, a stage where the memory of life shone brighter against the backdrop of emptiness. But for most, the silence brought only grief, a hollow reminder of how quickly the familiar could be unmade. Hunger began to carve itself into the city's bones. Without the regular flow of goods, people turned inward, living off what little they had stored. Flour barrels ran empty, gardens were stripped of greens, and rooftops were searched for pigeons that could be caught and eaten. The market, which had once promised abundance, now stood as a cruel reminder of scarcity. Its empty stalls were not just abandoned, they were accusatory, reminders of a life that no longer existed. And yet, even as the plague claimed its toll, there were faint attempts to keep the memory of the markets alive. Mothers told children stories of how the square had once looked, describing the colours of fruits and the sound of bells tied to donkeys. Old men recounted the songs merchants used to sing, voices that carried across the stone like music. In these retellings, the marketplace lived again, if only for the span of a few words. The silence could not erase memory, though it swallowed everything else. What made the silence of the market so profound was not only the absence of voices, but the absence of choice. Markets had been places where life was defined by decision, which bread to buy, which fish was fresher, which neighbours gossiped to listen to, With that choice gone, life itself felt narrower, smaller, dictated only by survival. Without the chorus of bargaining, people were left only with the sound of their own thoughts. And in a time of sickness, those thoughts rarely brought comfort. The longer the markets remained empty, the stranger the city became. Streets that had always led somewhere now seemed to lead to nothing. Pathways that converged on the square ended in silence. The heart of the city had stopped beating, and the limbs that stretched from it felt colder and weaker with each passing day. Still, even in the silence, life lingered stubbornly. A few traders, braver or more desperate than others, appeared now and then with baskets of onions or jugs of vinegar. Their voices were low, but they carried across the square, strange and fragile against the hush. Buyers gathered cautiously, and for a brief moment the space seemed to breathe again. But the gatherings never lasted. Another death, another rumour of contagion, and the traders vanished once more, leaving the stones bare. The markets without voices became symbols of the plague's grip, not only on the body, but on the spirit. They showed how quickly the familiar could be unmade, how easily the pulse of a city could falter when fear silenced its people. And as the days passed, the silence thickened, until it seemed that even the stones had forgotten the sound of voices calling across them. Yet beneath the silence, something remained, an unspoken promise that one day voices would return, that baskets would once again spill over with colours, that bargaining would once again ring out across the stones. For now, the market stood empty, a place of absence and memory. But even in its silence, it carried within it the shadow of what had been, and the faint, stubborn hope of what might one day return. The bells that once summoned the faithful now rang with a heavier weight. Their sound no longer promised comfort or celebration. It marked the passing of yet another soul. When the bells tolled, people did not look toward the church with hope, but with dread, counting each note as a tally in a city that seemed to be shrinking with every hour. The plague had turned even the sacred into something burdened, and at its centre stood the priest, a figure stretched thin between faith and despair. Priests had once been steady fixtures of daily life. They presided over baptisms, marriages, and festivals. They walked through the markets blessing children, offered words of comfort at doorsteps, and carried the scriptures into every corner of their parish. But now their role had narrowed to one unending duty: to stand at the edge of the graves and speak words over the dead. Their prayers, once delivered in cadence to guide communities, now fell into the air like whispers into a storm, lost almost as soon as they were spoken. The graveyards themselves had swelled beyond recognition. Where once only a few new mounds would appear in a month, the earth now seemed to breathe with constant upheaval, opening to receive one body after another. Grass was stripped away, soil piled in heaps, and the air hung heavy with the sharp odour of freshly turned dirt. At first, families gathered with candles, clinging to ritual. They brought the dead wrapped in linen, laid flowers, whispered the prayers they knew by heart. But as days multiplied into weeks, grief gave way to exhaustion. Bodies came too quickly, candles burned out too soon, and words faltered under the sheer weight of repetition. The priests could not keep pace. Their voices grew hoarse from speaking the same rites. Their hands trembled from blessing more coffins in a single day than they once had in a year. Some collapsed from sickness themselves, caught by the very closeness that their duties demanded. Others, in desperation, shortened the rites, reducing what had once been rich ceremony into a few hurried words and a sign of the cross, spoken before moving to the next grave. The ground became an unbroken sea of mounds, each marked more by necessity than by reverence. The grave diggers were the unspoken companions of the priests, men who laboured without praise, their work both essential and invisible. They carried shovels with splintered handles, their hands blistered and raw from endless digging. Some had been hired by the city, others pressed into service by necessity, and some simply remained because no one else would. They worked in pairs or small groups, lowering bodies quickly, covering them in earth, then moving to the next. At first they tried to dig with care, setting aside space for each soul, but soon the graves widened, filled with more than one body, then more still, until they became pits rather than resting places. The earth did not open easily. In summer, it hardened beneath the heat. In winter, frost made it unyielding. Yet the dead kept arriving. The diggers worked by day and by torchlight at night, their shadows stretching long across the uneven ground. Their labour grew mechanical, but never light. They carried the weight of both soil and sorrow, burying not strangers but neighbours, and often, eventually, their own kin. Priests and gravediggers formed an uneasy fraternity, bound not by choice, but by the gravity of their work. One spoke while the other laboured, one lifted prayers while the other lifted earth. Their roles overlapped in silence, for neither had the words to comfort the other. Sometimes, at the end of a long night, a priest would stand beside the diggers and watch as they filled the last pit. They would say nothing, only listen to the steady scrape of shovels. The diggers, in turn, would glance at the priest, their eyes hollow but steady, knowing that each depended on the other to keep the city from collapsing entirely into chaos. The graveyards themselves began to stretch beyond their walls. At first, new ground was consecrated beside existing cemeteries, but soon even that space was gone, and burials spread into fields, orchards, and abandoned plots of land. What had once been farmland now became an extension of the dead, rows of soil interrupted not by crops, but by the outlines of graves. In villages, bodies were sometimes buried hastily at crossroads or in shallow pits beside homes. The priests walked tirelessly from one site to another, their vestments stained by earth and weather, their voices thin from endless repetition. For the living, grief itself began to change shape. The rituals that once marked death with dignity became stripped down, blurred by necessity. Families stood apart, afraid to linger near others, watching as their loved ones were lowered quickly and covered. There was no time for hymns, no room for processions. Mourning was reduced to brief gestures, a whispered prayer, a tear wiped quickly away. The priest saw it all, bearing witness to grief without pause, absorbing more sorrow than one life should ever hold. The gravediggers, too, carried their own kind of grief, though it took the form of exhaustion rather than tears. They buried so many that names began to fade into numbers, faces into outlines. Some tried to remember each one, pausing to mark a cross in the soil or mutter a small prayer. Others hardened themselves, knowing that sentiment would only slow their hands. Yet even the hardest among them could not escape the weight entirely. At night, when shovels rested against walls and torches burned low, the silence pressed down, filled with the imagined voices of those they had lowered into the earth. And still, the work continued. Days blurred together, the line between priest and digger fading. Both became custodians of endings, standing at the threshold where the living world handed over its dead. Their presence was not heroic, nor was it remembered with glory. They were necessary, and in their necessity lay a quiet kind of devotion. Stories spread of priests who walked until their sandals wore thin, who carried oil and water until their hands bled, who spoke rites over strangers in languages they barely knew, because silence seemed worse than stumbling words. Tales, too, were told of diggers who collapsed into the very graves they dug, their bodies buried beside those they had lowered. Such stories travelled like murmurs, part horror, part reverence, reminders of the cost that service demanded. The churchyards, once places of quiet order, had become landscapes of chaos. Wooden markers toppled, names blurred by weather, graves dug too close to one another until the earth itself seemed confused. The priests tried to keep order, scribbling records in books that filled too quickly, ink smudged by damp hands. Yet even the records fell behind, and many were lost entirely. The gravediggers had no time for names or dates. They remembered only the weight of the soil, the sound of the earth striking wood, the endless cycle of covering what could never truly be covered. In the midst of this, there were moments when silence broke in ways unexpected. A hymn sung faintly by a priest, even when no one stood to listen. A digger pausing to catch his breath, staring at the horizon with eyes that refused to close. A child's voice calling out for a parent who would never answer. These sounds lingered longer than the tolling of bells, weaving themselves into the memory of a city that seemed to live more with the dead than with the living. As the plague deepened, priests and gravediggers became symbols of endurance, not of victory, for there was none, but of survival's stubborn persistence. They embodied the fragile line that separated a city from complete collapse, keeping at least the appearance of order when all else dissolved. Their work was not celebrated, nor was it thanked. But in the silence of markets, in the emptiness of homes, and in the endless swell of graves, their presence marked the faint suggestion that humanity had not yet entirely surrendered. When people passed by the churchyards, they sometimes caught sight of the figures moving slowly among the mounds, the priest with his book and oil, the diggers with their shovels. They did not stop to watch, they did not speak, but in their hearts, perhaps, there flickered a recognition that without those weary figures, the world might fall apart more quickly than it already was. The bells kept ringing, the graves kept widening, the words of prayer kept rising, though they were swallowed quickly by the air. And the earth kept closing over the bodies, one after another, until counting no longer seemed possible. The priest and the gravediggers remained at their posts, custodians of the silence, holding together what little thread of life still remained in a world unravelling. The stench of the graves clung to the wind, carrying with it a heaviness that seemed to seep into every dwelling and every body. But there was another element in the air, fire. Not the fire of warmth or hearth, but the fire of desperation, lit in doorways and alleyways, carried in iron pans along the streets, and stoked in great pyres on the edges of towns. It was thought that flame could cleanse what words and prayers could not, that smoke might drive away the invisible hand of death. People filled their homes with pungent fumes, burning juniper, pine resin, rosemary, and even the hides of animals. The smoke curled along ceilings and drifted through open shutters, thick enough to sting the eyes and choke the lungs. It was believed that bad air carried death into the body, seeping through breath and pores, and that fire could chase it away. Physicians wrapped their mouths with cloth soaked in vinegar, standing over braziers of smouldering herbs while speaking to patients whose skin was marked with swellings. Housewives set pans of fire at the feet of their children, while whispering prayers, as if the rising smoke could shield them from the unseen. Cities, already haunted by the sound of tolling bells, became shrouded in a constant haze. In markets where few dared to gather, vendors stood behind wafts of smoke, fanning it toward their stalls, as if to guard what little trade remained. In homes, the sick coughed amid thick air, their breaths mingling with the smoke until it was impossible to tell which sound belonged to illness and which to the flame. Nighttime streets flickered with orange light, shadows stretching and twisting as torches burned not just to guide the way, but to purify the very paths on which people walked. The fire was not only in the air, it appeared on the skin too, in the cruel swellings that rose beneath the flesh. The buboes, as they came to be known, appeared without warning, black or purple lumps that swelled under the arms, along the groin, at the neck. They burned with fever, pulsed with pain, and marked the body with a sign that none could ignore. Once the swelling surfaced, the body seemed to betray its own flesh. Skin flushed hot, blood raced in fever, and fire raged beneath the surface, as though the body itself were kindling. The physicians, with their long, beaked masks and robes, studied these swellings with a mixture of fear and fascination. Some tried to lance them, pressing blades into the swollen skin to let out the blackened pus, believing that release might draw out the sickness. The wounds left raw holes that burned even more fiercely, and patients groaned in delirium, begging for water that brought no relief. Others applied poultices of onion, garlic, or pitch, hoping to cool what could not be cooled. Still others rubbed mercury, vinegar, or strange concoctions over the skin, though such remedies often left the flesh blistered and raw. The fire beneath the skin seemed immune to all attempts. Families watched with dread as loved ones twisted in fever. The sick clawed at their bedding, tearing at clothes, trying to find relief for the burning that consumed them. Some plunged their arms into cold water, only to find the chill unbearable, as if fire and frost warred inside them. Others lay motionless, too weak even to speak, their eyes glazed but still reflecting the glow of torches that burned endlessly in the streets outside. In many towns, pyres were built for the dead when the graves could no longer hold them. The air grew heavy with the scent of burning flesh, mingling with the perfumes and herbs thrown onto the flames to mask it. From a distance, the glow of these fires lit the horizon, giving the night sky a faint red halo. Villagers watched from their homes as the flames climbed high, whispering that perhaps such fire might purify what the earth could no longer contain. Yet even in this, there was fear. People wondered whether the smoke itself carried contagion, drifting from the dead into the lungs of the living. The very elements of life seemed turned against humanity. Air carried poison. Water was feared, for some believed it spread sickness. Earth groaned beneath endless graves. And fire, once a comfort, became both cure and curse, protector and destroyer. It was stoked in every corner, yet it never seemed to stop the fever that consumed the body. Children learned to live with the sight of smoke. They played quietly near doorways where braziers burned, their laughter subdued by the sharp odour that stung their throats. Old men sat by fire pits, staring at the rising smoke as if it might carry away the memories of the countless funerals they had endured. Women stirred pots of herbs over flames, not to cook food, but to make bitter brews meant to cleanse the body from within. Every gesture revolved around fire, as though the element itself might decide who lived and who died. Some nights, fear drove entire communities to gather around great bonfires, chanting prayers, tossing herbs, even throwing coins and trinkets into the flames as offerings. Faces lit by the glow appeared both desperate and resigned, the fire reflecting in eyes hollowed by weeks of loss. The flames roared, sparks rising into the darkness like fleeting stars, while the people whispered that the smoke might lift their suffering heavenward, carrying their pleas to ears that felt distant and silent. But even as fire was called upon to cleanse, it also destroyed. Houses were sometimes set alight when sickness lingered within them too long. Families abandoned everything they owned, setting torch to roof and wall in the hope that the plague would die in the flames. Entire rows of cottages were reduced to ash, leaving blackened skeletons of homes still smouldering long after their inhabitants had fled. These blackened shells stood as reminders that in fighting death, people often sacrificed the very spaces that had once sheltered life. The fire within the body, meanwhile, ran its course with merciless speed. Those marked by buboes often burned with fever until their strength dissolved. Sweat poured from them, their lips cracked, their skin flushed, and then grew pale as life drained away. At times the swellings ruptured on their own, releasing foul-smelling matter that stained bed linens and filled the room with an odour that no herbs could mask. Families who remained near enough to care for the sick wept as they tried to clean wounds that refused to heal. And often, within a day or two, the fire burned itself out, not with recovery, but with silence. The priests, exhausted from their endless rounds of burials, spoke of the fire in both spiritual and earthly terms. They said it was a punishment, a purging flame meant to scour the sins of mankind. They pointed to the smoke rising from pyres as both warning and promise, that the world itself was being tested in fire. Grave diggers, standing beside the priests, saw it differently. To them, the fire was simply another weight to carry, the smell of burning flesh mingling with the smell of earth, both clinging to their clothes, both impossible to wash away. Yet amid the terror, there were those who clung to hope in fire's presence. Some whispered that those who survived the fever, who endured the fire on their skin, emerged with a strange strength, immune to the sickness that claimed so many. These survivors bore scars from the swellings, but walked with the rare fortune of continuing life. Their presence became both mystery and inspiration, proof that perhaps the flames within could burn away the plague itself. Families clung to these stories, hoping that their loved ones too might emerge scarred but alive. The cities and villages lived in a haze, smoke rising from every corner, fever burning in every home. The nights were no longer truly dark, for the glow of fire was constant. And in that light, people moved like shadows, their faces lined with fear, their voices subdued, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the fire around them was never enough to extinguish the fire within. The air carried both smoke and silence, pressing down upon a world that seemed to be unravelling. Fire licked the sky. Fire raged beneath the skin. And all the while, life clung stubbornly to its fragile thread, flickering in the glow of flames that promised cleansing but delivered only ash. When the fires dimmed and the fevered cries fell quiet, what remained were the figures who had outlasted the storm. They moved through towns where silence pressed harder than sound, where every echo of a step bounced against empty walls. Survivors walked streets no longer crowded, no longer loud with vendors or church bells, but strangely hollow, as if even the buildings themselves had withdrawn into mourning. These survivors carried a strange weight. To have lived when so many had not was not always a blessing. They had been marked by endurance, yes, but also by a solitude that few could have imagined before the plague came. In every village, faces that once gathered at wells, in markets or at doors were gone. What remained were scattered individuals who looked at each other across the ruins of their communities with the eyes of strangers, even when they had once been neighbours. The survivors lived with memory as constant company. Each corner of a street reminded them of someone who no longer walked there. Each doorway recalled a friend who had vanished behind it. The silence of abandoned houses was loud in its own way, as if the walls held on to laughter and voices that the air no longer carried. At night, when the glow of fires no longer burned so bright, the quiet became almost unbearable. Dogs howled at distances that felt too close, and the rustling of rats in the dark seemed to mock the emptiness that now belonged to the human world. For those who had endured, the body carried reminders too. Some bore scars where the swellings had once burned beneath the skin. Others carried a different mark, the knowledge that they had watched entire families collapse around them while they alone had risen from their sickbeds. Many awoke each day with the unsettling thought that they had been spared for no reason at all, while others, perhaps more deserving, had not. Guilt sat as heavily on their shoulders as grief. Hunger pressed hard against them. Fields had gone untended, crops withered where no hands had come to reap them, and barns stood quiet with doors open to scavengers. What food remained was often guarded fiercely, and yet in many places it spoiled untouched, for there were too few left to eat it. Survivors scoured markets where only dust gathered, and they broke into storerooms that once belonged to merchants whose names had already been forgotten. It was a world of plenty for too few, and yet that abundance tasted bitter when eaten in silence. The churches, once filled with prayers, and the drone of hymns, became vast caverns of emptiness. The candles sputtered before altars where no congregation gathered, and the echo of a lone survivor's footsteps seemed out of place in halls built for many. Priests themselves were rare, most taken by the same sickness they tried to guard against. In some villages, survivors stepped hesitantly into the role, not as true clerics, but as keepers of memory, lighting candles in the hope that flame might hold back the crushing weight of absence. There was no celebration in survival, only a slow realization that life was now a task to be shouldered. The survivors rebuilt routines in fractured ways. A woman swept the steps of a home where only she remained. A man tied his donkey to an empty cart, guiding it through streets where there were no buyers. Children played in the dust of squares where no one came to watch them. These gestures were not for commerce or duty, but to preserve the rhythm of existence, to remind themselves that they were still human in a world that had almost forgotten humanity. Loneliness brought strange changes to the mind. Some began to speak aloud to the air, carrying on conversations with voices that once filled their days. Others adopted animals as companions, feeding stray dogs or cats that had lingered when their owners had vanished. These creatures, too, bore the look of survival, their ribs showing, their eyes watchful. In their company, survivors found fragments of comfort, as if life itself was insisting that it would not yield entirely to silence. There were wanderers too, those who could not remain among the ruins of their past. They set out along roads where grass began to push through cracks, carrying little more than what could be tied to a bundle. Their footsteps took them past villages as hollow as their own, and through fields where only the wind bent the grass. Some walked until they reached cities that had been more thoroughly emptied, their vast streets stretching out like hollow bones. Others travelled with no direction, guided only by the need to see if life still existed beyond the horizon. When these wanderers did meet, the encounters were uneasy at first. Fear still clung to them, fear that another might carry the sickness in their body, even after it had ebbed. They watched each other carefully, kept their distance, and spoke with voices made hoarse by disuse. Yet as time passed, they found themselves drawn together, sharing meals, telling fragments of stories, piecing together companionship from the remains of a broken world. These gatherings, however small, became flickers of life in the darkness, proof that even after so much loss, humans still sought the presence of one another. Survivors also faced the weight of inheritance. Land that had once belonged to many now lay open, claimed by no one or by the few who remained. Houses stood ready to be entered, storerooms filled with goods unguarded. For some, this sudden abundance brought strange fortune. Peasants who once served masters now found themselves free, able to claim fields that no lord remained to demand. But the wealth of the dead was as much a burden as a gift. To walk through a home and take what was left behind was to feel the ghost of its former owner in every object touched. In cities, the survivors faced a different challenge. Streets, once teeming with movement, had become dangerous in their stillness. Without enough people to guard them, buildings collapsed into disrepair. Thieves prowled through deserted quarters, scavenging not just for food, but for objects they could hoard, though there were few left to trade with. Fires sometimes started in abandoned houses and burned unchecked, consuming entire rows before anyone came to notice. The survivors who remained in such places learned to live among ruins that grew with each passing month. And yet, within this bleakness, seeds of resilience stirred. The survivors discovered that the earth itself, though scarred by neglect, still held promise. Some began to till fields once more, cautious at first, planting small patches of grain or vegetables. Others gathered herbs from hillsides, relearning the ways of survival that their ancestors had once relied upon. With so few mouths to feed, the harvests seemed meagre, but were enough. Slowly, the rhythm of life bent itself to the smaller number who remained, as though the world was shrinking to fit them. Children among the survivors bore a different kind of mark. They were old beyond their years, their games tempered by the weight of what they had seen. Some spoke rarely, their eyes reflecting more than their words. Others clung fiercely to scraps of play, making toys from bones or bits of broken wood, filling the empty air with the sound of laughter that felt almost fragile. In them, the survivors placed their hope, for if life was to continue, it would be carried in those small, stubborn voices that still found ways to sing. The lonely survivors, scattered and reduced in number, did not see themselves as victors over the plague. They were fragments of what once had been vast and busy worlds, remnants left behind by fire, fever, and silence. Yet, even in their solitude, there was the faintest glimmer of persistence. They woke each day, gathered what food they could, tended to what little they had, and reminded themselves that breath still filled their lungs. That act alone, continuing, became its own form of defiance. The world had nearly emptied, but it had not vanished. Roads, though quiet, still stretched toward horizons. Fields still grew with weeds that could be turned back into crops. Rivers still ran their courses, carrying water that reflected the sky. And in that world, lonely as it was, survivors walked slowly forward, carrying with them not triumph but endurance. They were proof that humanity, however broken, however scarred, had not been extinguished. The plague's shadow did not stop at the edge of villages or towns. It crept through the gates of strongholds and over the thick stone walls of castles that once seemed beyond the reach of sickness. Even those who believed themselves guarded by battlements and surrounded by moats could not close their doors against a breath carried in the air, or the fleas clinging to a rat's fur. Soon, the towers that had risen so proudly over valleys and rivers became silent, their windows dark, their great doors unbarred, not from welcome but from neglect. Survivors who wandered from emptied villages sometimes stumbled upon these fortresses. At first they might have expected to find safety there, food stored away, soldiers on watch, halls filled with warmth. Instead they discovered corridors where only their own footsteps echoed back to them. Tapestries that once displayed wealth hung limp and heavy with dust. Armour stood in corners like hollow men, guardians of nothing, their surfaces dulled by air that no hand came to polish. Inside the great halls, where feasts once stretched from dusk until the small hours of morning, the silence was almost unbearable. Long tables stood empty, their surfaces still bearing stains from old wine, the wood scarred by knives that had once cut through meat served in plenty. The smell of roasted game and spiced dishes had long since faded, leaving only the mustiness of stone and the faint trace of ash from hearths that no longer burned. Where once the laughter of lords and ladies had risen to meet the vaulted ceilings, there was now only stillness, broken by the occasional drip of water or the flutter of a bird that had found its way inside. The chapels within these castles told the same story. Candles sat melted into puddles at the base of iron holders. Altars bore dust rather than offerings. The prayers of knights and nobles had fallen silent, their words swallowed by death before they could carry any further than the stone walls. The coloured glass of windows still caught the light of the sun, scattering it across the floors in patches of red, blue and gold. But there were no worshippers left to lift their eyes and see it. Not every castle had been emptied all at once. Some had held out longer, their lords insisting that isolation within walls could preserve them. Guards kept watch on the ramparts, servants carried food from storerooms, and physicians paced nervously through chambers. But the sickness was patient. A single cough, a single shadow of swelling, and the fortress became a prison. Families locked themselves away, each chamber turned into a tomb. In the end, the silence settled over these places as surely as it had over the villages below. Wanderers who dared to push through heavy wooden doors found scenes left as though frozen in time. In one chamber, a feast had been abandoned mid-course, goblets knocked over, bread hardened on plates, a chicken still half-carved beside a blade. In another, a bed lay tangled with sheets where no one had risen, the impression of a body long vanished still pressed into the fabric. Dolls rested in nurseries where the children who once clutched them had disappeared. Castles that had been symbols of stability now stood as monuments to absence. The grandeur of these halls made the emptiness sharper. In small huts, loss felt intimate, personal, a breaking of close bonds. But in castles, the scale itself seemed to mock the few survivors who wandered them. High ceilings amplified every sound, and the vastness of the architecture seemed to underline just how small the living had become compared to what once had been. To walk across the echoing floor of a great hall alone was to feel the full weight of history pressing down, reminding the survivor that these stones had been laid for multitudes, not for one solitary figure. Nature began its slow reclamation of these structures. Vines crept along walls that no gardener trimmed back. Weeds sprouted between flagstones of courtyards, where horses no longer stamped their hooves. Birds nested in the eaves, their calls filling the spaces once commanded by trumpets and horns. Rats, as always, scurried through storerooms and kitchens, gnawing at sacks of grain and scattering seeds across the floors. Even foxes and wolves sometimes prowled courtyards, emboldened by the absence of men. The wilderness was not hasty, Saul, but it was patient, and stone by stone it began to soften the edges of human ambition. For some survivors, these empty castles offered shelter. They lit small fires in kitchens built for banquets, ate their meagre meals beneath ceilings designed for grandeur, and slept in corners of chambers where once entire households had dwelled. Yet even in safety, the halls bore down on them. The richness of the surroundings was too loud a reminder of what had been lost. To sit on a carved chair, or drink from a goblet encrusted with jewels, was to feel like a trespasser in a world that had ended. Children who found themselves within these abandoned strongholds sometimes filled the emptiness with play. They ran down long corridors, their voices echoing strangely, making games of hide-and-seek behind thrones or beneath great tables. To them, the castles were not ruins, but labyrinths of wonder, places where they could chase their imaginations without boundary. Yet even their laughter, brief and high-pitched, seemed swallowed quickly by the stones, as if the walls themselves resisted the sound of joy. Legends began to cling to these hollow places. Whispers harried across villages that certain castles were haunted not only by memories, but by restless spirits who had perished within. Some told of knights seen pacing the battlements long after the last garrison had fallen. Others spoke of voices carried on the wind through arrow slits, as if the dead continued their conversations in another realm. Survivors who believed such tales avoided the castles, letting them stand alone, looming over valleys as grim reminders rather than sanctuaries. Yet others, bolder or more desperate, scavenged what they could. From storerooms they took grain that had not yet spoiled. From chambers they gathered blankets, tools or weapons. Some even pried loose pieces of furniture, dragging them down into villages to make use of them in homes that still clung to life. In this way, the riches of the dead trickled down to the living, the grandeur of the castles dissolving piece by piece into the smaller, quieter needs of survival. The hollowness of the noble halls mirrored the hollowness felt across the land. Authority itself had withered alongside those who wore crowns and titles. The castles, once centres of power, no longer spoke with the voice of command. Their bells no longer summoned vassals, their banners no longer waved to signal dominion. Instead they stood mute, their stone walls empty of meaning. Those who once bowed before their gates now walked past them without pause, for they owed nothing to the dead who had ruled within. But even in their emptiness, the castles endured. Their towers still cast long shadows across fields. Their silhouettes still caught the setting sun. Travellers passing at a distance might see them and remember the days when those walls symbolised strength, even as they now knew them to be fragile in the face of plague. They became markers of memory, fixed points in a world that seemed otherwise dissolved. At night, when the moon cast its pale light across their battlements, the castles appeared almost alive again. The shifting of shadows made windows seem watchful, and the sighing of wind through arrow slits echoed like faint whispers. Those who slept within such walls often woke uneasy, unsure if the silence around them belonged to the present, or if it carried the faintest trace of the voices that had once filled the chambers. In time, many castles would fall into ruin, their stones pulled down for other uses, their halls collapsing into heaps of rubble. But in the immediate years after the plague, they stood eerily intact, hollow shells of a grandeur that had been drained in an instant. Survivors who passed through them could not help but feel the weight of both past and present pressing together, the reminder of human ambition and the truth of its fragility. They were not simply abandoned structures. They were monuments to a silence that stretched beyond their walls, silence that hung over an entire world reshaped by death. To step through their gates was to step into the heart of absence itself, and to leave was to carry that absence back into the still living world. And so the castles remained, watching from their hilltops and riverbanks, their banners gone, their halls hollow, their stones unyielding. They stood as witnesses to a time when humanity nearly vanished, holding within their silence both the memory of grandeur and the echo of loss. The silence of abandoned castles did not remain contained within their walls. It bled outward, spreading across villages, fields and towns, until the very air itself seemed weighted with unease. People carried this silence inside them, turning it into whispers, prayers, and half-formed words that struggled to make sense of what surrounded them. Where once language had been a tool of trade, of poetry, of laughter shared in marketplaces, it now became something else entirely, a fragile vessel for fear. The plague did not only claim bodies, it altered the way people spoke, the sounds they used to express themselves. In streets where neighbours once greeted each other warmly, Words shrank into nods and murmurs. Voices grew cautious, as though a loud tone might summon the sickness itself. Superstitions wove themselves into sentences, and fear crept into every conversation. People carried their terror not just in their eyes or in their gestures, but in the very structure of their speech. Mothers whispered lullabies with tremors in their voices, uncertain if their children would live to hear another. Priests spoke more urgently from pulpits, their sermons peppered with warnings of sin, repentance, and divine wrath. In taverns where laughter and songs had once filled the smoky air, men spoke in low tones, swapping rumours of death counts and strange omens. Even children's games adopted the rhythm of fear, chants twisted into verses about graves, masks, and angels of death. Whispers about the plague spread faster than the plague itself. Each town carried its own version of the story, shaped not only by fact, but by dread. Some claimed the disease floated visibly in the air, a mist that moved through the streets at night. Others swore it was carried by strangers, by merchants with foreign accents, by beggars at the gates. In this way, suspicion became another language, spoken through narrowed eyes and words chosen with care. The vocabulary of everyday life began to twist. Common words carried new meanings. To say someone had a mark was no longer to describe a bruise, but the telltale swelling of the sickness. To mention the cart was to evoke not trade or transport, but the grim procession of bodies wheeled through the streets. Even time itself seemed redefined. Days no longer measured by the tolling of bells or the rise of the sun, but by the number of deaths counted from morning to night. Chants and rhymes carried fear from generation to generation. Some believed that words themselves held power, that to name the plague aloud was to give it strength. People invented euphemisms, calling it the pestilence, the great mortality, or simply it, as though avoiding the name could soften its bite. Others leaned into the opposite belief, speaking the word boldly, hoping that by naming the terror they might strip it of its authority. Neither approach brought safety, but both reflected the way language bent under the weight of fear. The streets filled with processions of penitents who sang hymns not of joy, but of desperation. Their voices cracked as they begged for mercy, their chants growing louder as their hope grew smaller. Some sang verses they believed could ward off sickness, words repeated over and over until they lost their meaning, reduced to sound and rhythm, a drumbeat of fear echoing through the night. For those listening, these chants were not comforting, but haunting, filling the darkness with the sound of human despair. Rumours, carried on the fragile wings of language, fed panic more effectively than any visible sign of the disease. A single whispered story, that a town to the north had been wiped away, that wells had been poisoned, that strangers carried the curse, could send entire communities into chaos. Markets emptied overnight. Families fled their homes without farewells. Language, once a bridge between people, became a spark that ignited suspicion, turning neighbours against one another. Accusations slipped easily from fearful tongues. Outsiders were blamed, their different speech or foreign mannerisms marked as evidence of guilt. In some places, whole groups were targeted, their words twisted into proof of conspiracy. Communities fractured under the pressure of whispered suspicions, and the plague gained another weapon, division born from language itself. Yet not all speech was consumed by dread. In quiet corners, words still carried threads of comfort. A husband murmuring to his wife that tomorrow might be kinder, a mother promising her child that the sickness would pass them by. These small phrases, fragile though they were, carried weight equal to sermons or proclamations. In a time when fear had reshaped speech, words of hope glowed faintly like embers in the ashes. reminders that not every sentence was surrendered to despair. Even silence spoke its own language. To see a neighbour and exchange no words was itself a statement, heavy with caution. Silence between family members sometimes said more than conversations could bear. In dining halls where meals were eaten quickly and without discussion, the clatter of utensils became a kind of speech, communicating hunger, fatigue, and unease without syllables. In this way, silence grew into its own dialect, one everyone understood. As the plague deepened its hold, even written language bore its mark. Town records became dominated by lists of the dead, names copied hastily, margins filled with numbers rather than words of law or trade. Letters carried not tidings of marriage or harvest but grim tallies of losses. In monasteries, scribes continued their work, but the words they copied seemed almost weightless against the reality outside their walls. Margins filled with notes, "All the brothers are gone," became testimonies of despair preserved in ink. Graffiti, scrawled hastily on walls and doors, gave voice to fear where mouths dared not speak it. Crude drawings of skeletons, words warning travellers to keep away, prayers scratched into wood with trembling hands. These became part of the city's landscape. Language carved or painted on stone and timber became a permanent echo of fleeting terrors, left behind long after their writers were gone. The language of fear was not confined to words alone. It showed in the pacing of speech, the sharpness of tone, the way voices broke or faltered. It was carried in sighs, in the shudder of breath between sentences. Even laughter, when it surfaced, bore a nervous edge, brittle and quick, as though people feared that joy itself might summon punishment. Every utterance seemed tinged with caution, every syllable an act of survival. Travellers carried this language from one place to another, spreading not only rumours, but the very cadence of fear. A frightened accent picked up in one village was repeated in the next, shaping a shared vocabulary of dread that crossed borders more swiftly than armies ever had. Across Europe, people who had never met spoke the same tongue of whispers, suspicion, and fragile hope, united not by trade or kinship, but by a common terror. This language outlasted the plague itself. Even as the sickness ebbed in certain places, words remained shaped by the memory of it. Songs carried traces of its verses. Proverbs echoed its warnings. Children learned rhymes their grandparents had invented in the shadow of death. The plague carved itself into culture not only through loss, but through the words that loss created. Fear had reshaped language into something sharp and uncertain, a mirror of the world that people now inhabited. The words carried weight because they were tied to survival, to the desperate need to make sense of chaos. And though centuries would pass, echoes of that language would linger, the remnants of whispered prayers and half-spoken fears still heard faintly in the fabric of human memory. The castles remained hollow, the halls still vast with silence, but in the villages below, the air itself seemed filled with invisible threads of speech, broken, whispered, fearful. The plague had taught humanity not only about death, but about the fragility of the very words with which they tried to resist it. And so, the language of fear became as much a monument as the abandoned fortresses on the hillsides. It carried within it the story of survival, of suspicion, of despair, and of hope, an invisible record written not on stone or parchment, but in the breath of those who lived through one of the darkest passages of history. The words of fear lingered in the air, shaping the way people spoke and thought, but beneath those whispers was another silence, heavier than all the rest. It was the silence left behind by children who would never grow older. Their laughter had once filled streets, fields, and narrow alleyways, weaving a brightness through communities no matter how poor or weary the adults around them were. But as the plague spread, it cut through that brightness with ruthless precision. The disease did not spare the young. It carried them off as quickly as their parents, leaving behind toys abandoned in the dirt, half-finished games etched into cobblestones, and lullabies left without an audience. For many families, it was the children who were taken first, their smaller bodies offering little resistance to the sickness. What remained was an emptiness that stretched beyond grief, because children represented not only love, but the future. Their absence created a world that felt drained of tomorrow. Villages once filled with the shrill energy of childhood became eerily quiet. No one shouted in play across the meadows. No stones were kicked down the lanes. Schoolrooms, if they survived at all, grew thinner each week, their benches emptying one by one. Some were abandoned entirely, the chalk dust settling like another layer of loss over cracked boards. In cities where children's chatter once blended with the calls of merchants and the clatter of carts, the hush was even more startling. Markets no longer echoed with little voices tugging at sleeves for sweets or fruit. Doorways lost the familiar sound of games spilling out into the street. The void was unmistakable. Graves multiplied. In many places, children were buried in mass pits, their names never recorded, their lives measured in mere handfuls of seasons. Parents too sick to stand could only watch as strangers carried their little ones away, knowing they would never again see the curve of their faces or hear their laughter. Even those who survived often found themselves unable to erase the image of those small bodies lowered into the earth. The memory of such losses lingered longer than the plague itself. Playthings became relics. A wooden horse with chipped paint, a rag doll with one eye missing, a carved whistle left silent. These objects were kept not for their utility, but for the memories they contained. Families who remained surrounded themselves with these items, not because they offered comfort, but because letting them go felt like surrendering what little connection they had left. Whole households became museums of lost childhoods, every corner filled with reminders of voices that had gone quiet. The rhythm of childhood songs, once a steady undercurrent in daily life, fell away. Games that children had played for centuries, circling dances, counting rhymes, clapping songs, vanished in many places, forgotten because there were no voices left to carry them forward. Later generations would inherit fragments, sometimes twisted into darker versions, their verses marked by images of sickness, graves, and angels. It was as though the plague had reached forward in time, etching its presence into the very words children would sing long after it had ended. For those who survived, childhood became something fragile and strange. A child might wake one morning with siblings all around, and by the week's end, find themselves the only one left. Some grew up without ever remembering what it felt like to play freely, their days consumed instead by mourning or by work forced upon them to fill the absence of adults. In this way, the plague aged children too quickly. It robbed them of games, of learning, of innocence, turning them into caretakers, labourers, or wanderers before they had even learned the fullness of joy. Wandering orphans became a common sight. Barefoot, hungry, their faces hollowed by grief and famine, they roamed the roads in search of food or shelter. Some clung together in makeshift families, small clusters of survival stitched out of necessity. Others wandered alone, too small to understand why the world had grown so empty around them. Churches and monasteries tried to take them in, but their walls were already overflowing with the sick and the dying. Many children simply disappeared, lost to hunger or exposure, their stories never told. For parents who remained, the weight of survival grew unbearable. Some looked upon their surviving children with a mixture of relief and dread, knowing each day might still steal them away. Others became fiercely protective, shielding them from the world, shutting doors against neighbours, speaking in hushed tones as though loud words might draw the plague nearer. But even love itself became twisted under the pressure of fear. To love a child was to risk devastation, and yet to withdraw that love was to deny them the warmth they needed most. Families lived suspended in that impossible tension. Communities carried the collective wound of lost generations. With so many children gone, whole towns faced a hollowed future. Apprenticeships broke down because there were no young hands to train. Fields lay untilled because there were no boys to guide the ploughs. The continuity of knowledge faltered. Recipes, songs, hymns, Krafan stories vanished because those who would have learned them never reached the age to remember. A culture without its children is a culture cut off from its own future, and the plague made that severing brutally clear. Even art bore witness to this absence. Painters sketched children with hollow eyes, sometimes shown clinging to mothers who themselves were pale with sickness. In some surviving manuscripts, illustrations of little skeletons dancing alongside larger ones reveal a grim acknowledgement of how the young had not been spared. Bells tolled not only for kings and merchants, but for infants whose names would never reach the chronicles of history. The grief of parents often found no outlet. Many had no energy left to weep. Some, broken by loss, retreated into silence. Others turned to rituals, repeating prayers endlessly, as though words might bridge the gap between themselves and the children buried beyond their sight. Graves filled with offerings of small objects, pebbles, flowers, scraps of cloth, tokens of love given to those who could no longer receive them. In this way, even mourning became a language reshaped by the absence of children. The memory of these children lingered not only in the homes where they once lived, but in the very rhythm of villages and towns. A marketplace without their laughter was not simply quiet. It felt emptied of its heart. A church without their high voices in the choir was not simply muted. It was diminished. Its prayers weighted with a heaviness that adults alone could not lift. Childhood was not merely a stage of life lost. It was a spirit missing from the world itself. As years stretched forward, survivors carried those memories with them. Parents who had lost all their children grew old with no descendants to inherit their homes or names. Entire family lines ended quietly, disappearing into the earth along with the toys and clothes of children who never grew older. Where once a surname might have stretched through generations, it now ended abruptly, erased by the plague's cruelty. But even in the midst of so much sorrow, life's persistence showed itself in small ways. Some children did survive, and for them, the silence left by their peers became a strange inheritance. They carried the weight of memory without always understanding it, told by their parents of brothers and sisters they would never meet. They lived in a world that expected them to carry more than childhood should allow, yet their very existence became a symbol that life could continue. In their stomachs, the world found its hesitant way forward. The children who never grew old left behind not only sorrow, but a permanent scar in human history. They shaped the way communities understood fragility, the way parents viewed love, the way cultures remembered loss. Though their voices were silenced, the echoes of their absence reshaped everything that followed. In fields where laughter had once risen with the wind, the stillness carried memory. In towns where games had once marked the hours, the emptiness became a shadow of what was gone. And so, in the long night of the plague, the world carried not only the burden of death, but the deeper wound of futures never lived. Children had always been a promise, a sign of days to come, and their loss transformed the world into a place uncertain of tomorrow. The silence they left was not only a mark of the plague's cruelty, but a reminder of how deeply humanity depends on its youngest voices to keep time moving forward. The countryside, once so alive with rhythm and sound, fell quiet in ways that had never been known before. Fields stretched outward, heavy with crops that no one came to gather. Grain bowed under its own weight until the stalks bent and broke. Orchards ripened, fruit dropping to the ground to rot where it lay. The work that had always marked the seasons, ploughing, sowing, reaping, was interrupted, not because the land had failed, but because the people had. The plague did not spare the hands that tilled the soil. Farmers fell ill in their cottages, leaving oxen untethered, tools abandoned, and barns half filled. Families that had worked the same fields for generations suddenly left them to weeds and silence. Paths once worn down by the steady movement of carts and hooves grew wild again, grass reclaiming what had been trampled flat by centuries of labour. In villages, hunger crept in despite the abundance lying wasted in the fields. With too few workers, the gathering of food became impossible. A family might look out upon acres of wheat golden under the sun, yet have nothing to eat but scraps of stored bread. Hunger deepened the despair already heavy from grief. The sight of wasted harvests became another kind of wound, reminding people daily that nature had given generously, yet they could not take what was theirs. Cattle lowed in neglected pastures, their ribs showing as they wandered without care. Sheep scattered into hillsides, unshorn and untended. Goats climbed into abandoned gardens, eating what remained of once carefully planted rows. The order of farming life collapsed, replaced by chaos that mirrored the breakdown of society. Entire herds perished, not from sickness, but from simple neglect, their bones scattered across meadows like another testimony to human absence. The rhythms of agricultural life had always been steady, grounding people in the certainty of seasons. But now that rhythm was broken. The plough no longer carved furrows when spring arrived. Seed no longer found its way into the soil. The harvest moon rose over empty fields, its light falling on stalks never gathered. Without the labour of human hands, the cycle itself seemed to falter, as though time had slipped loose from its anchor. Famine followed in the plague's wake. Even when food lay uncollected, distance and danger made it inaccessible. Villagers were too weak to travel, too fearful to venture into neighbouring lands where sickness might still linger. Grain rotted in one region, while another starved, because the web of exchange that once tied communities together had unravelled. The bonds that linked field to market, market to household, could not hold under the weight of so much death. Those who did attempt to gather food often found themselves alone in vast, silent landscapes. A single figure might move slowly through a field that once required dozens of workers, cutting stalks with a scythe while shadows lengthened around them. The silence of such work pressed heavily, every swing of the blade echoing with the absence of those who should have stood beside them. Harvest, once a communal act filled with chatter, became a lonely ritual performed by survivors. In some places, opportunists arrived to take what they could. Abandoned farms were stripped of grain, livestock, even tools, leaving behind only hollowed houses and barren soil. But theft offered no lasting solution. There was too much loss to be mended by greed. As months passed, the scavengers too disappeared, consumed either by plague or by the same hunger they sought to escape. The landscape itself began to change. Where fields once stretched in neat rows, weeds surged forwards. Wildflowers spread across meadows where wheat should have risen. Trees took root along abandoned boundaries. Blurring the edges of farmland, nature pressed against the absence of human order, reclaiming in months what had taken generations to shape. To walk through such places was to see a world both beautiful and sorrowful, vivid growth rising from the silence of human ruin. For those who had lived their entire lives bound to the land, This transformation was bewildering. Farmers who survived returned to their fields to find them overrun, as if strangers had taken possession in their absence. To begin again required strength many no longer had. Some tried, pushing ploughs through hardened soil with trembling hands, but progress was slow. Others abandoned the effort, leaving the earth to its new wildness. Villages that once relied upon careful cycles of planting and harvest could no longer sustain themselves. Bread ovens cooled, their stones unused. Mills grew quiet, the sound of grinding grain replaced by the murmur of rivers flowing past unused wheels. Markets that had once smelled of bread, cheese and fruit offered only emptiness. Hunger became a companion that no prayer could banish. The absence of harvest reshaped even the rituals of the church. Harvest festivals, once marked with music and processions, were cancelled or transformed into sombre gatherings. Priests prayed over empty baskets, blessing what was no longer there, asking for mercy on communities that could no longer feed themselves. Where bells had once rung in celebration of bounty, they now tolled in mourning for both lives and livelihoods lost. Children who survived grew up in landscapes of scarcity. They did not learn the songs of planting or the chants sung during harvest work. Instead, they learned silence and hunger, carrying memories of fields they could not eat from. The knowledge of how to tend land threatened to slip away, as entire generations lost both teachers and traditions. Farming, which had once been the heartbeat of society, became uncertain, its continuity fractured. The psychological toll was heavy. For people bound so closely to the land, to see it overflow while they starved created a dissonance almost unbearable. It was not only bodies that weakened, but spirits. Many came to believe the earth itself had turned against them, that their labour had been rejected, their prayers ignored. The sight of unharvested grain became a haunting image, a reminder that abundance and deprivation could exist side by side. The breakdown of food supply reshaped movement across regions. Survivors left ruined villages to seek sustenance elsewhere, wandering through countryside dotted with fields gone wild. Roads filled with stragglers carrying what little they had left, their eyes searching for smoke from a hearth that might welcome them. Yet hospitality grew rare. Households were too fearful of strangers bringing sickness, or too depleted to share what they had. Starvation joined the plague as a silent companion on the roads. Some communities did manage to endure. Small clusters of survivors banded together, pooling what little strength they had. They worked side by side to gather neglected crops, to keep a few animals alive, to replant when the seasons allowed. Their survival was precarious, but it represented the persistence of human resilience. These groups left behind stories of endurance, passed quietly through generations, testifying that even in the darkest of times, the will to keep planting, keep harvesting, never fully died. Over time, the collapse of harvests reshaped the balance of power. Land once farmed by peasants without question now stood empty, and lords who relied on their labour found themselves weakened. Survivors could bargain for better terms, choosing where to work, demanding more freedom, because their labour had become scarce. The empty fields whispered not only of death, but of change, hinting at a transformation in the way society itself would be structured in the years that followed. Still, the immediate memory was not one of progress, but of silence. Travellers crossing Europe in those years described wide tracts of fertile land lying useless, entire valleys without the smoke of a hearth or the call of a farmer to his animals. The land was alive, but humanity seemed absent from it, as though the earth had been left to dream alone. The image of fields without harvest lingered in the imagination long after the plague had loosened its grip. In stories, in songs, in sermons, it appeared as a symbol of abandonment, a reminder of how fragile the bond between people and the land could be. Generations who had not lived through the plague still inherited the memory of empty fields, carried in the words of their elders, told around hearths where bread was once again being baked. The silence of those abandoned fields was more than the absence of crops. It was the absence of community, of continuity, of the heartbeat of ordinary life. In the quiet of weeds rising where wheat once grew, people saw not only their hunger, but their own fragility. The earth could endure without them. The land could cover over their absence in wild growth. But for humanity, the absence of harvest meant a life suspended, caught between survival and extinction. In those long years, the landscape itself became a kind of monument. Not carved from stone, not built of wood or glass, but written into the earth itself. Rows left unplanted, orchards left untended, meadows filled with the bones of animals. These were the markers of a catastrophe too vast for words alone. To walk through such places was to feel the weight of a history not recorded in books, but written in silence and soil. And so the Black Plague's devastation was not only counted in the number of graves, or in the silence of children's voices, but in the harvests that never came. The earth had been ready to give, yet hands were too few to take. In that imbalance lay one of the clearest signs of how close humanity came to unravelling entirely. The world did not awaken from its nightmare in a single breath. The Black Plague, which had fallen so suddenly and violently, did not simply lift like a passing storm. Instead, it withdrew as it had arrived, slowly, unevenly, and without reason that human eyes could understand. Town by town, valley by valley, the shadow thinned, and yet no one could say why. The same winds that once carried it across oceans and fields still blew. The same trade routes still existed, though far emptier than before. And yet there were places where the death carts no longer rolled, and the bells tolled less often, as though some hidden clock had wound down. What remained were people who could scarcely remember what life had been before. Those who had lived through the waves of sickness found themselves in landscapes so altered that survival felt almost like waking in another century. Entire families were gone. Streets that once echoed with the shouts of market traders stood in silence. The darkness had not truly left. It lingered in memory, in superstition, in the hollowness of so many doors that would never again open. But in a strange and fragile way, the world began to breathe again. It often began with something simple. A baker in a village dared to light his oven again, though no customers came on the first day. A shepherd returned to the hills, leading a flock reduced by neglect, their wool tangled and coarse. In certain ports, ships once again approached the shore, without immediate suspicion of doom. These were not triumphs, not signs of victory over a disease that had defied prayers, rituals, and medicine alike. They were simply small movements forward, carried out quietly, as though no one wanted to tempt the silence that had replaced the cries of the dying. The retreat of the plague did not bring peace, however. It left behind a vacuum filled with confusion. For centuries, villages and towns had been bound together by rhythm, the sowing of seed, the ringing of church bells, the hum of voices in taverns and markets. Now those rhythms were broken. Farmers who survived often found themselves standing before fields thick with weeds, land that had been left untended for years. There were too few hands to pull the earth back into order. The dead could not be coaxed back into the furrows, and so the living laboured with an exhaustion beyond the physical. It was not merely the land they tilled, it was time itself that needed restoring. In some places, forests crept closer to once thriving towns, as if the world had been given back to nature. Wolves padded across old roads, no longer fearful of human noise. Birds nested in towers that had stood for centuries, their stone halls filled now with the flutter of wings rather than the clamour of human ceremony. where vineyards had stretched in neat, patient rows, brambles now twisted, thorns catching on the robes of priests who passed in solemn processions, carrying relics to ward off the sickness that might yet return. The retreat of the plague was not simply a human story. It was the land reclaiming its breath after being interrupted by centuries of ploughs and hammers. Still, people were slow to trust. Every cough in a tavern made heads turn. Every fever was regarded with suspicion. Rumours travelled faster than carts could roll, whispering that the plague lingered in corners, waiting for the moment when people forgot their fear. And in truth, the shadow did not vanish entirely. It smouldered, rising again in sparks and waves, never as terrible as its first strike, but enough to remind the survivors that their lives remained fragile. A new kind of time began, a time measured not in years or seasons, but in intervals between outbreaks. Among those who lived through it, silence became a constant companion. Silence of the villages emptied. Silence of families reduced to one or two. Silence in the churches where the prayers had gone unanswered. And yet within that silence, something else stirred. Reflection. People looked at the structures around them, cathedrals, markets, laws, even the crowns upon kings, and found them less certain than before. If a sickness could sweep across the known world and bring all ranks to their knees, what power truly held sway? This question lingered, reshaping not just daily life, but the very way people thought of existence itself. The retreat of the plague also altered wealth and power. Noble houses that had survived sometimes found their lands stretching further than before, left vacant by those who had perished. But these estates were useless without labour. The peasants who remained discovered themselves in a strange position, their lives still fragile, but their hands newly valuable. Wages rose in some places. Freedoms were demanded in others. What had once been taken for granted, an endless supply of workers bound to the soil, was no longer assured. And so, in manor halls where silence had reigned, arguments began to replace it. Who owed what? Who ruled whom? The retreat of darkness did not restore the old world. It began to carve a new one. The fear, however, was never far behind. At night, in towns where taverns reopened, men told stories of entire caravans swallowed by sickness on forgotten roads. In villages, mothers still traced charms on the doorways of their children's rooms, whispering prayers to keep shadows from creeping back under the roof. Even in cities where trade returned, merchants carried sprigs of herbs or amulets as if invisible armies still surrounded them. It was as though the plague had not merely scarred the flesh, but had carved itself into the imagination of a generation. The retreat of darkness was not the absence of fear. It was fear becoming part of daily life, woven into its fabric like thread too tightly pulled. And yet, even in this fragile and haunted landscape, there were moments of resilience. Children were born who had never seen the piles of the dead. Festivals flickered back into being, though quieter, more subdued. Bells once used to mark burials rang again for weddings. The living clung to rituals, not because they believed these could ward away sickness, but because rituals reminded them that life still moved forward. A loaf of bread broken and shared, a song whispered by a mother to her child, a candle lit in a window. These were not victories over the plague, but they were gestures of survival, and survival was the only victory that mattered. As the decades stretched on, the memory of the Black Death became both a warning and a ghost. It was told in hushed voices, passed down by those who had seen too much, and half believed by those born into its shadow. Whole generations grew with the knowledge that humanity had nearly disappeared, not by war, not by fire, but by something invisible carried in the air, on the skin, between breaths. That knowledge never faded. It lingered in the way people built their houses, in the way they crossed themselves at the sound of coughing, in the way they trusted neither stranger nor season. And so the world moved on, scarred but not broken. The darkness receded, but never completely. Its retreat was not the dawn of peace, but the dim light of a new world, a world reshaped by loss, silence, and memory. Where once villages bustled with sound, they now whispered. Where once rulers felt unshakable, they now trembled. The retreat of the plague was not triumph. It was survival, fragile and trembling, like a candle flickering against a wind that might rise again at any moment. The darkness had slowed, had thinned, but it had never truly ended. When the plague's grip loosened, it did not feel like triumph, nor even relief. It felt instead like standing in the ruins of a storm, the sky clear, yet the ground still soaked, broken branches lying where they had fallen. The world had not been restored. It had been remade, though no one had asked for such a remaking. Fields stretched empty, villages stood hollow, and yet within this emptiness, a strange, cautious breath returned, as though life itself had hesitantly decided to remain. The first signs were small, almost invisible, too fragile to name as hope. Smoke rose from chimneys again, not in the dense, choking haze of pyres, but in the thin ribbons of households attempting to cook bread. The echo of footsteps returned to cobbled streets, where weeds had begun to grow between stones. Markets that had once been abandoned filled slowly with voices, though fewer than before, each transaction carrying the faint astonishment that trade still had meaning in a world where so much had been lost. People who had spent years expecting only death began, reluctantly, to expect tomorrow. The world that learned to breathe again was quieter than the one that had collapsed. Songs returned, though softer. Festivals flickered back, though more modest, their colours subdued. Weddings were celebrated with laughter tinged by hesitation, as though each vow was also a plea whispered into the air. The weight of memory hung heavy in every gesture. Life did not rush back. It trickled, it seeped, as water finds its way into cracks of stone. And yet, even trickling water has power. In towns where grass had crept through abandoned squares, children once again began to run. Their voices, thin but insistent, filled the silence that had lingered for too long. The generations who remembered the Black Death watched them with both wonder and unease, knowing how fragile such laughter could be. But the children themselves carried no memory of carts rolling through streets or bells tolling without end. Their innocence was not ignorance, it was renewal. Through them, life reminded itself that it could continue without always fearing the shadow of yesterday. The air itself seemed different. Without the endless smoke of burning bodies, skies looked clearer. In some places, forests had spread during the years of abandonment, stretching into pastures and climbing over stone walls. When people returned, they found themselves not only rebuilding homes, but negotiating with nature that had crept back into their absence. Deer wandered into village lanes. Birds nested in the rafters of half-collapsed barns. It was as if the earth had taken its own deep breath, using humanity's pause to reclaim what had long been pressed under ploughs and axes. The world that breathed again was not the same world. It was a quieter, wilder one. The survivors carried themselves differently. Before the plague, hierarchy had seemed immovable. Lords over peasants, priests above the flock, the crown above all. Afterward, those lines had blurred. So many lords had perished that their lands stood empty. So many peasants had died that their labour was scarce. Those who remained discovered new leverage. A ploughman who once worked fields without question could now demand wages. A mason who survived was suddenly indispensable, rebuilding walls and bridges with hands no one else possessed. The great calamity had levelled not only populations, but also the certainty of power. And yet, the scars remained in every interaction. A cough at a feast could silence laughter. A fever in a household could empty streets overnight. Fear lingered like smoke clinging to clothes long after the fire was out. People had learned to breathe again, but they breathed cautiously, aware of the air they shared. The unseen enemy that had once stolen entire families still haunted imagination. No one could forget that death had travelled on breath itself, invisible, unstoppable. Breathing was no longer simple. It was survival wrapped in memory. Communities, once fractured by grief and isolation, began to stitch themselves back together. Churches, emptied by loss, became centres again, though their sermons carried a new gravity. Faith had not been abandoned, but it had changed. The plague had silenced priests as easily as peasants, bishops as swiftly as beggars. Now, words from the pulpit were more hesitant, laced with humility. The world had seen the frailty of every rank, and the memory of that equality lingered even as rituals returned. In cities, bells rang once more, but their tones were different. No longer constant signals of death, they now marked hours of work, of worship, of gathering. The sound was both comforting and unsettling, for each peal reminded listeners of the years when bells had never stopped. The air vibrated with memory, even as life moved forward. People listened to bells as if they were listening to their own survival. Trade routes reopened. Merchants ventured again along roads once feared. Their carts lighter, but their steps more deliberate. Ships crossed seas where ports had once refused to dock them. Coins exchanged hands. Goods travelled. With each transaction, the world reconnected its severed veins. And yet, the hum of commerce was slower, softer. Each deal was shadowed by the awareness that all wealth could vanish in a season. What mattered now was not only gold, but the ability to endure. Art and stories began to bloom in the silence left by loss. Songs carried not only grief, but resilience. Murals appeared in churches, painted by hands that trembled but still worked, depicting skeletons dancing beside the living. A reminder, a warning, a kind of acceptance. Writers described a world reshaped, their words threading sorrow with astonishment. The plague had stripped life bare, but in the aftermath, it had also made each detail sharper, each breath more noticeable. The world that learned to breathe again was not a world that forgot. It was a world that carried memory like a scar across its chest. Fields were sown once more, but farmers bent over the soil with a kind of reverence, as though each seed was a fragile rebellion against emptiness. Markets bustled again, but every handshake carried the ghost of fear. Houses were rebuilt, but the gaps where neighbours had once stood remained as silent testaments. Generations passed, and still the story of the Black Death lingered, carried in whispers, in prayers, in superstitions that endured long after the sickness itself had ebbed. Children who never knew the plague grew up hearing about it at firesides, learning that the air they breathed had once nearly destroyed humanity. And perhaps because of that memory, they cherished the air more, the sun more, the fragile fact of being alive more. The darkness had retreated, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. The world stood scarred, trembling, but it stood. In the quiet return of footsteps on forgotten roads, in the hesitant laughter of children chasing each other through overgrown fields, in the simple rise and fall of chests drawing breath without fear. Humanity reminded itself that survival was not only possible, but inevitable. The world had learned to breathe again, not as it once had, with thoughtless confidence, but with caution, gratitude, and the unshakable knowledge of how easily breath could be stolen. And in that slow, steady rhythm of breath, life began to write its next chapter. The Black Plague, a shadow that once pressed upon humanity so heavily that it seemed the world itself might break. We have walked together tonight through the villages and towns that trembled, through the silence of empty streets, through the cries of loss, and through the fragile recovery that followed. It was a time when the very breath of life felt uncertain, when hope seemed as fragile as a candle in the wind, and yet the world endured. Out of famine, plague, and fear, humanity found a way forward. We learned to till fields again, to gather in marketplaces again, to hear bells ring and children's laughter rise where silence had once fallen. The scars never vanished, but in those scars, people began to shape something new, a resilience that carried the centuries after. As you lie here now, listening to the quiet flow of this story, I want you to think of what we've faced together in this telling. The empty roads, the graves that filled faster than names could be spoken, the weight of despair, and the long patience of recovery. It was not only history, it was a mirror of endurance, of what it means to bend without breaking, to suffer yet to survive. And so, before we close tonight, I'll leave you with this thought. In every age, humanity has been tested. The Black Plague was one of its darkest nights, but even then, the dawn still came. If you found yourself carried by this quiet journey through time, take a moment now to subscribe to this channel. It helps these stories of history reach others who may need the calm of them, just as you do. And share in the comments where you are listening from, and at what hour of the night. I like to think of them as little lanterns across the world, glowing gently, one by one. Thank you for being here tonight. Sleep well, and may your dreams be lighter than the shadows of history.